What the UFO? I'm Caleb. If you're enjoying the show and you're finding some value here or having a little bit of fun, please support us on patreon.com/WTUFO. We're only looking for $1 a month. If that's too much, we totally understand. Please do not support us. But if $1 a month right now is easy for you, please sign up to be a supporting member. It'll really help the show a lot, and we deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much. Patreon.com/WTUFO. Okay, second housekeeping note for this episode, we're talking to Dr. Michael Cifone, and you're going to hear in the interview I don't do a great job of explaining at the top why Dr. Michael Cifone is here. The main reason that we're talking to him is that he founded this organization called the Society for UAP Studies, and he is historically a professor of the philosophy of science. So we talk for about an hour about the philosophy of science, theoretical underpinnings of science as a practice and the way we understand the world. So it's very interesting, but it's not very UFO focused until about 50, 55, maybe even an hour in. So if you're really only here for the UAP stuff, you can hop right to that and get started and enjoy the second 2 hours. But if you have more of a general interest in science and philosophy, you might enjoy that first hour. So one more double click on this. Societyforuapstudies.org is the website where you can check out Dr. Cifone's work. It's a really cool organization. I think they're doing something pretty special in the UFO field, which nobody else is really doing, and that's reaching out through multiple disciplines to try to bring people together. And as we'll discuss in this episode, Dr. Cifone produced the first peer-reviewed journal about UAP, maybe arguably ever, but certainly since the last one folded in, I think, 2009 or maybe 2012. So he's doing really good work to bring people from multiple disciplines into this area scientifically, and he's converting academics who have been skeptical about it, and he's helping them do serious work to move this field forward. So that is why he's here. That's why we're talking to him. And that's why we spend an hour talking about theoretical physics. All right. Hope you enjoy the episode. Thank you very much. What the UFO? I'm here with Dr. Mike Cifone today. Hi, doctor. Thank you for spending time with us.
Hello, Caleb. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. Thanks.
I really appreciate you taking the time, and I would love if you could just start with giving us a quick overview of your academic career and maybe end with what you're up to right now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've had a weird itinerary. I started out in music all the way back in 1996. It's going to be a long story now, but yeah, music, theology, even these were kind of my interests early on, and I have to admit, like some people in this world, I never really was that. I mean, I was kind of distantly interested in the idea of UFOs, but I never, I never really, I never focused on it. I watched, X-Files and all of that, but it was always kind of just a thing there in the cultural sphere. I mean, we can talk about that a little bit later. So that's just to say that, I started out in my academic career. I had no idea, where I would end up now. But I quickly was interested also in philosophy. That seemed to be kind of something that hit close to my heart. I guess I grew up as a very spiritual kid, embedded in Catholic culture in South Philadelphia and the Italian community there, which still had a very powerful at that time. And in the 1980s and 90s, there was a strong immigrant sense. We still carried that with us, actually, that we were different than the rest of the culture. People might not know that, but we didn't identify with what we called the white Americans or whatever, even though we're white and so on. But we had this different perspective. We were the target of racism, for many decades, from the existing American population. So that it gave us this, this kind of an interesting perspective. But I grew up in a very immigrant heavy, Italian, Southern Italian kind of little pocket of community in Philadelphia, in the 1980s. And 90s. I was born in 1978, so I came at the end of the 70s, right? So I lived through the 80s and into the 90s, and it was I saw all kinds of transformations. But So I grew up as a really religious kid. I identified with the values of the church, and I lived like a liturgical calendar kind of thing. I was very close with my grandmother, who was active in the church, so I got to see a lot of the inside of what Catholicism or what a religion could actually be like. So I saw, even though I saw a lot of vanity and um sort of values inconsistent with what I would call the core, of Christianity, for example. I saw a lot of wonderful things too. I also grew up very poor, so I saw, the side of the church where those values of simplicity, of giving, of generosity, of helping, of sort of like Christ-like love. I actually saw that put into play,
Mm.
and that left a lasting impression on me. I saw it from a number of different kinds of priests and different members of the religious community, sisters, nuns, and brothers and priests and lay people. I saw what it could actually be, and
Mm.
that left a really profound impression on me. So I thought I was going to end up, becoming a priest or entering, a school to study theology or something like that.
Mm.
But at some point, I don't know, religion became an object of criticism for me. I lost a lot of really close family members when I was a kid,
Mm.
and that also then left an impression on me in the sense of, kind of this expectation of this divine reality that is supposed to be there, and and protecting you, and so on. And then I see my loved ones die, my grandmother and my aunts and people I was very close with, and of like horrible diseases, right? And I
Mm.
saw them decline very rapidly and shocking, and that really like put a lightning bolt through my heart. I mean, I was shocked, and I couldn't accept that, so so I tore away from religion, and I ended up going towards sort of science
Mm.
and ultimately then philosophy, sort of secular philosophy, I guess.
Mm.
Even though I maintain, I think, an orientation in a kind of spirituality of some kind, but I kind of abandoned the kind of traditional trappings of religiosity per se, and I became, very attracted by science and physics in particular. And that's something that actually, I got that from my dad. He's a science fiction fan, and always we were always talking about, the various possibilities with technologies. And at that time, also it was just at the time, in the early 90s, when I was kind of getting into all of science and to physics in particular, we were just discovering other planets, and this kind of starts to open up the world to you, like the whole universe to you and to your mind, and you start wondering, about life and the possibility of alien intelligence and so on. And my dad, he kind of was interested in the UFO stuff, not heavily. There were some books lying around. I think he had Whitley Strieber's Communion,
Mm.
and I picked that up in 1990 something.
Oh, wow.
And I read that. That scared the hell out of me. I mean, I'll be totally honest. I mean,
It's
that
pretty
that
scary.
it was horrifying to read it. And then, I would go back and forth. I'm like, well, if this was real, then I would be really scared. 'Cause it's not just a
Mm.
scary story. This is something that happened to somebody.
Mm.
If it were the case, then, so I had that really profound sense of, if that's the case, then the world as we understand it is really much, much different, perhaps even darker in
Mm.
a way that we had ever thought. And, but I read that, I didn't accept it one way or the other. It was just something really scary. And I was wondering, is it a possibility, that
Mm.
something like that could be real? And but again, I never attached myself to it, and I never thought through it, carefully, or followed through with it. But in any case, these were just, some of the my earliest, encounters with the subject as I was kind of moving towards science. But for me, becoming interested in science, in physics and then philosophy, it was like it was adding a kind of a foundation, to my understanding of things. It never became for me a kind of a force of skepticism,
Mm.
maybe of a critique of sort of traditional notions of culture and religion and so on, but it never became this sort of force of skepticism, closing down on the possibility of a kind of expansive reality which we don't, which is sort of outside of the boundaries of science. So for me, science was the beginning, not the end, which is,
Mhm.
it's where we're starting to
Indeed.
understand about the structure of the world, instead of having it to be a closed, presenting you with this sort of body of fixed, beliefs and dogmas, as it were. For
Mhm.
me, science was never like that. It was, I recognize that there's this historical dimension. We're just starting to learn about stuff, and surely we're getting a lot of it wrong.
Mhm.
And so I was attracted to that, to this possibility that science is this kind of historical process. But wait a minute, I need to learn what we've learned. I mean, we've learned stuff about the world. And so what
Mm.
is that? The structure of matter, the structure of the cosmos, planetary formation, possible, conditions being replicated elsewhere for life. We know some stuff, from our immediate experiences. And I just became really fascinated by the history of how that came about,
Mm.
and also how that came about through philosophy.
Mm.
And so I started to fill out my understanding and as to how science emerges by understanding, the long, many thousands of years of history before what we consider to be modern science, and what laid the foundation and opening up our mind towards, this scientific tradition, which now has become so central, to our societies the world over. And so I became, really interested in the philosophical, underpinnings, and that's kind of where I ended up going into from undergrad to graduate school. So I met, a number of really profound mentors in undergrad,
Mm.
and that I always emphasize to my students now, and then to my younger brothers. I'm like, that time where you go to university and you're exploring is the most important time. That's where you feel what your passion is, inside of your person, inside of your soul. And that's kind of, I found teachers to open me up to that. I found a philosopher, a physicist, and a psychologist.
Mm.
They walk into a
Interesting.
bar, and then suddenly, no, and and they kind of showed me, so Michael, if this is what you want, if you want to really understand the history and philosophy of science, then here's what you need to know and here's what you need to do. Because I had a fear of, of math. I had a fear of, like, sort of the more formal side of science. I like the
Mhm.
idea of science, right? But then actually getting to doing it, I was always a little bit scared. And they forced me to do it,
Mm.
so I jumped in the calculus class and physics 101. It was scary, man. I was like, I'm not going to get an A in this class, it scared the hell out of me.
Mm.
And I had to struggle, and actually study, and eventually, I made my way up to getting really good grades in physics and math finally. And I impressed
Wow.
myself, I'm like, well, hell, if I would have actually studied and put my head to it all these years, in grade school and so on, and high school, I would have actually accomplished. And that's what my teachers always said, you have to apply yourself. You have to apply yourself. And I actually started to do that in college, and I realized, I can really achieve. So I lost my fear of math and science. I don't consider myself a good mathematician. I don't consider myself a good physicist, surely. But now I have a kind of a conversant, a familiarity with it, so that I can be conversant, with professionals and who work in it, in a scholarly capacity. So I'm very happy I did that. So my mentor sort of, um, you know, angled me to get into a program in graduate school in the philosophy of science. And because of my interest in, theoretical physics, quantum theory, and relativity that I was developing as an undergraduate, and actually trying to learn these theories, I found a really great philosophy of physics program at the University of Maryland, down in College Park. I applied. I sent in my paper on relativity. I think, what the hell was that paper about? Yeah, I think I do remember. So there's this interpretation of special relativity, right? Because of the relativity of time and space. You get to the point where you realize that, because time and space are relative, there's a sense, and now philosophers will argue this until the cows come home, but there's a sense in which, the future, the past, and the present are kind of all there.
Mm-hmm.
And that the differences that we have are somehow, in some sense, that requires a lot of articulation. There's a sense in which those are perspectives on the same block of reality. So there's this interpretation of special, and I have to emphasize that this is an interpretation. It's not necessary for one to accept this view, but a very common interpretation of special relativity is that what we call the relativity of simultaneity, or the relativity of time and space, implies a block universe in which past, present, and future are equally real. Because you can have events in your future which for me have not yet occurred, but yet I meet you. You're certainly real, so I have to extend the reality of the events you've said are real, even though for me these events have not yet occurred. They could be in my future. For you, they're present. And you can make geometrical arguments and show that in fact would be the case for some sets of observers. And this is an allowable state of affairs in special relativity. And it gets even more exotic in general relativity, because you can have the weird warping of space where the world lines are curving and intersecting with themselves in weird paradoxical ways. So it looks like time and space, have this kind of block structure to it, almost as if it's fixed. And that when I say something is present for me, it may not, and I might meet you, and you may have a different set of events, but all of our events have to be kind of, in some sense, real, right? I mean,
I remember a physics teacher I had describing this as a fruitcake once for some reason. Like, we're all in this big chunk of stuff, and all the parts of the fruitcake are real, and then where it's weird is that
you're
we're
just
somehow
in
moving
one
through the
location.
fruitcake. But it all exists.
It all exists in some sense. So, but there is no one observer for whom all events are present, I guess, is one way of thinking about it. Except, I don't know, maybe at the Big Bang. I mean, that's because all the world lines converge into one point. But anyway, so I wrote a paper on this, and they liked it at Maryland, and so I got accepted as a teaching fellow, or on a teaching fellowship, I should say, as a graduate student, which is great. I got money to go to Maryland, and the professors there were just, they were the next level. They were absolutely brilliant folks. The training that I received there, even though as I can explain, I've departed in many ways from these traditions in which I was trained. The training that I received was just absolutely top notch. These are thinkers at the top of the profession, right? Of technical philosophy of physics, philosophy of science, and in philosophy. So I got to interact even with physicists because of the subspecialty I was in, philosophy of physics. In fact, even in there's a subspecialty called the foundations of physics. And my mentors were, in fact, instrumental in bringing that tradition about. And the foundations of physics is a kind of an ongoing project, where you have philosophers who are sort of conversant with and trained in physics, interacting with, publishing with, you're giving conferences with actual physicists. Theoretical physicists, right? Of the caliber of Roger Penrose, Stephen Hawking. I mean, the greats. I mean, I met Roger Penrose. I met Ed Witten too before he died at his 90th birthday in Princeton. But I've interacted, so my mentor, Jeff, was the student of David Bohm, who's one of the great sort of second generation quantum theorists. In fact, it was his textbook that was, I think, published in the mid 1950s. I think it was 1956 or 57, which became the standard textbook for many people for many years, who, as you may know, or famously developed this thing that we now call the Bohmian interpretation of quantum mechanics, which was an attempt to satisfy Einstein's requirement, of sort of determinism in science, in physics. Like, in other words, determinism is if you give me this, the properties of a physical system at time t1, and you give me a complete description of that physical system. If I give you a law of motion or the equation of motion that evolves that system in time, then I will know where and how that system will evolve for all time in the future, t plus 1, 2, 3 to infinity, and I will know where it has come from in the past. That is a kind of a determinism that was well known, since the 18th and 17th centuries. As soon as we knew kind of the form of Newton's laws, we knew that, well, all other things being equal, the laws of motion give you unique outcomes, for physical states of the system, assuming you give me a complete description of what's happening at this one moment for this physical system, and we assume that nothing else is influencing it, then I'm going to get a deterministic outcome. Well, it turns out in quantum mechanics, you can't get that. You can give me the position of momentum, but I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly deterministic.
Because Heisenberg screws this up with the uncertainty principle about being unable to identify both the spin and the position of a subatomic particle simultaneously.
I mean, it turns out, right. It turns out that I can't give you sort of like a complete deterministic description of a system, because some of the physical variables don't have simultaneous values. In other words, if I have the position of a particle, in somewhere, its momentum is infinitely uncertain. So you have these the uncertainty relationships, which is in principle part of the theory. It's not like, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. That's actually the nature of the theory, is that certain physical variables are what we call non-commuting. That if there's a definite value for one, the other conjugate value is infinitely uncertain, not just uncertain, but infinitely uncertain. So if I know definitely where a particle is, I don't know what its momentum is, which is strange, because momentum is a function of velocity, and velocity is just dx dt. It's a function of the position. So you would think, well, I know the position of the thing, so I should be able to compute the momentum, but I can't. But the theory says that the momentum is infinitely uncertain. And in fact, if you try to perform an experiment, to try to determine what the momentum should have been, or what, you realize that it's just not possible.
And is it the case that that's more than just a sensor problem? Like,
That's
not just that the experiment affects the particle.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one of the mistakes that people make, is that that the Heisenberg uncertainty relationships just tell you something about like what I can know because my instruments are like disturbing the system.
Right. Yeah, that was my initial.
No, it's worse than that. It's that the value, literally, according to the theory, is infinitely indeterminate.
So it either
doesn't have a value
or a position, but it does not, in fact, actually have both.
It can't. It can't. In fact, if you assume that it does, you get the wrong predictions from the theory. So the theory is only consistent if these, certain physical variables like position and momentum are satisfy the Heisenberg uncertainty relationship. So there, it's important to point out that these uncertainty relationships are ontological. They're not just about how much information I can get out of a system. Now, okay, some people will push back on that because they don't think that the theory gives you an ontology. They think that the theory is just a tool to calculate predictions, and they don't want to take it too seriously. Like they don't want to commit as to that it's giving you a realistic description of what exists,
of the nature of reality.
Yeah. And
So,
that's a philosophy of science question, because
okay.
it turns out that that's a meta theoretic interpretation. That's, in other words, that's a way of interpreting theories. Whether the theory should be interpreted realistically or just as an instrument of prediction or whatever, or just giving me something about the ways in which human beings can extract information from systems and so on. So today, I think if you don't want to be a realist, and say that a physical theory gives me a description of the way that reality is, the alternative these days is to say, well, it's not that the theory gives me a description of the way that reality is. It gives me the structure of information that I can extract from a physical system. So there's I think there's this trend these days to go information theoretic. And that's certainly certainly a viable way of thinking about physical systems. Physical systems, you interact with them and you get some bits of information about those systems. And it turns out that quantum theory, if you want to look at it like that, just imposes really severe limits on the extent to which information can be extracted. And there's a certain structure that information will have. There's a certain structure of correlations, that the instruments and the physical system that you're interacting with, there's a certain structure of correlations that will emerge. And that's just, the way to look at that is that's just the kind of the structure of information that we can get out of this interaction between, the detector or, the instrument I'm using to interact with the system, which is what I want to know about. I want to know about that system.
And maybe the consciousness involved in.
Well, that's another question.
What's going on? Yeah, right.
That's another question.
More confusing question. But bringing it into the present here, is this the kind of thing you're working on right now?
No, this is the kind of thing that I did in graduate school. So, as I was saying, sorry, I know I'm the typical sort of academic. I get sidetracked, but
no, it's great. I asked for the history.
This is it. So, so my mentor was the student of David Bohm. Unfortunately, Bohm died, in the 90s. I never got to meet him. I got to meet everybody who knew Bohm, but he left a lasting kind of impression on a whole generation, the third generation of people trying to come to terms with what in the hell quantum theory is really about. I mean, that for me, that and the interpretation of relativity theory, both special and general, those were the two focuses of my graduate work. And especially the question of quantum theory in relation to relativity was a specific kind of concern of mine to kind of reconcile these two. So eventually the work that I did with other colleagues, for which I published a number of papers in physics and philosophy journals, involved developing a joint interpretation of relativity and quantum theory to try to bring them into some kind of harmony. And that is, or at least it has been, I'm not an active scholar now in this particular area, but I still keep up, with the developments. But the fundamental problem, right, that we face in physics, which I think gives us a lot of hope, right, that science is still, of course, historical. It is changing. The outstanding problem today is, of course, and has been for many decades, how to reconcile, this kind of indeterminacy of quantum mechanics with the very deterministic kind of picture that you get with relativity. Relativity, in a sense, is the conclusion, I would argue. It's in a way, maybe you can even see it like this. It's in a way the logical conclusion from the sort of the way of thinking that was inaugurated very early in the scientific revolution by Galileo. where Galileo criticized, the preceding tradition of Aristotle for not being careful enough in understanding the extent to which perspective matters in science. That the fact that you see something and that it appears to be one thing doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way it is. In fact, it has to be tested through thought experiments and experiment actual conditions that you create in a laboratory setting. And that broke the tradition of Aristotle really in half. I mean, it was a seismic shift. But that Galilean relativity, where he realizes that, I can be on a ship moving, steadily on an ocean, a calm ocean, and I can be in a room on land, and I won't necessarily be able to tell the difference between those two points of view unless I was on a ship and it was stormy seas. Then things change, right? And then I started to notice differences. But purely from that point of view, I could be in motion and at rest, and that's relative.
Yeah, so I can see how you're drawing a line from that to Einstein's points about traveling at different speeds and living in relative different environments.
And because Aristotle thought, well, surely the Earth isn't moving, because if I let an apple go out of my hand, it will go behind. The Earth will rush forward and it'll leave the apple behind. But that's not what I see. I drop it and it falls right under my hand. Therefore, the Earth is at rest.
Interesting.
I mean, but Galileo points out, yes, but I can have the same experiment on a ship. And if someone's watching what I'm doing on the ship from the shore, they'll see the thing actually moving. But the people on the ship will see it drop right under my feet, right? So it's relative. So he introduces this perspectivalism, right?
Yeah.
And
I didn't know it showed up that early.
Yeah, right. It's the 1500s. And that parallels the development in art at the time. In the Renaissance, you have this focus on perspectivism, right? Where they're getting really specific, putting the viewer, in a sense, ad infinity, I guess, in a way, outside of the picture, but looking into the picture and giving you proportions and a kind of a perspective, right, inside of the picture, and creating a sense of presence. Right, so there were these movements right during the Renaissance that kind of sets up the stage for these interesting developments in science, which are very sophisticated criticisms of the tradition that came before, and very subtle criticism. And then out of that, you go from Galilean relativity, Newton, and then I would say it kind of comes to a conclusion in Einstein. And that for me ends the classical tradition. And the real break is quantum theory. I mean, that's where you're no longer in Newton's world. You're no longer in Galileo's world. You're no longer in this world of sort of intuitive kind of physics and determinacy and definite, and physical variables having definite values forever, and being sort of like part of the structure of reality in a fixed way. No, you're not in that universe anymore. Something changes, and I mean, we can go on and on about it, but it may just be as simple as, well, maybe we have to accept that the relativity that Galileo introduces for motion and space, and then Einstein with time, because that's sort of anti-Newtonian. Like the relativity of time was inconceivable, really, in a way, until the 19th century with Einstein. But maybe the final move here is that just like time and space have this kind of relativity to them, well, guess what? Maybe all physical properties in some sense are relative or relational, and they depend on context. And so it kind of, and that's the interpretation that I tend to favor with quantum mechanics, that the physical properties that we describe reality with, and therefore physical systems with, and then we write down our equations to describe formally, maybe those properties are not like there, independently of all context, but rather are sort of sensitive to some kind of context, that maybe they're relational, is what some people say. So
that
like
there is no objective place to stand in which you can see one truth throughout the universe in all ways,
right. So like tallness,
frames. So like what? Sorry.
Like tallness. I don't know how tall are you?
Oh, 5'9".
Okay, I'm about 5'10" and a half.
Okay.
So, but I haven't told you what frame of reference I'm in. So if we're strict Einsteinians, right, I would have to say, with respect to the following, I have a state of motion of X and you have Y relative,
So based on how fast you're going, your height might change.
Yeah, exactly. Now, of course, you're on the planet Earth and so am I. And so our relative motion is probably 0. And so I can say that I'm a little bit taller than you in this frame of reference. But it turns out that an observer moving really rapidly, depending on their state of motion, they're going to get a different value for length, right?
So
And
there's this problem that there might not be an objective frame from which to describe all reality.
Well, right. There's no frame of all frames.
And
guess what you had in Newton, or at least implicitly, when you read the Principia, you realize that he's making this assumption. There is a frame of all frames.
A universal frame, an ideal frame.
Precisely. And you know what he considered that to be? He considered that to be God, actually.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, he says this in weird places, that space is like the sensorium of God, and of course time is the equal measure of all events in all places, and within the frame of God, of course. So
that's
God,
what I thought about when you described the block universe and said nobody's able to conceive it all simultaneously, except a theoretical divinity, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Yeah, the view from nowhere, this sort of this absolute observer that stands outside of all measurement and of all time and space. That is, in a sense, the ghost, if you will, that haunts physics to this very day. And
a spirit haunting physics.
Yeah, it totally is. And the relationalism, and I think that we're still working this out in philosophy and physics. Relationalism is the final negation of this, frame of all frames thinking, which is basically Newtonian, and it's basically theological in a sense.
It's interesting. It's also philosophically rough. It's difficult to grapple with a universe in which there's no absolute objective.
Yeah, we want a grounding of all ground. We want like a final. Here it is. Here's the foundation, and then everything is referred to this foundation, and that foundation doesn't change.
Right.
It's fixed. But unfortunately, that might not be the way reality is. Nothing is fixed in a sense, especially if you believe that reality, or at least that the cosmos, is historical in nature, right? It's possible. This is the kind of thing that Lee Smolin, another philosopher whom I met, who now is suffering from Parkinson's. Unfortunately, he's not doing too well these days. But Lee Smolin is one of the great minds, I believe, of this kind of interim period where we're trying to reconcile relativity and quantum. We're not quite sure how to do it. And there are a number of these brilliant minds. They haven't quite solved the problem, but they've advanced our understanding about the nature of the problem, right? We're in this kind of space. So it's kind of like we're in the late 19th century, sort of again. We're kind of searching, But Carlo Rovelli, by the way, is the one that I was kind of thinking of when I was talking about the relational interpretation of physical properties as a solution to the sort of some of the mysteries of quantum theory in relation to relativity. But then there's Lee Smolin, who really focuses on the problem, of quantum gravity, reconciling quantum mechanics and and relativity. And Smolin, a number of years ago with the philosopher Mangiabera, I forget, he's I think he's Argentinian, a great philosopher at Harvard, or yeah, I'm sorry, Yale. Um, he developed this notion of the temporality of the laws of nature, that the laws change, you
Mm.
know,
Mm-hmm. Like
and that
universal constants could be evolving, for
yeah, and that's
example.
a weird thing because the constants are supposed to be, again, they're supposed
Constant.
to be fixed, they're
Right.
they're but if you really sort of take seriously the historicity of reality, like that history is not just a story we tell about events that happen in a physical space, but that the physical space and all properties that we think of as being objective are also subject to time in
Mm.
some very fundamental,
Mm.
profound sense. Well, that's something that physics has a really hard time
Mm.
in really grappling with, because you always need a fixed frame of reference with respect to which things are evolving.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's all sort of evolutions
Yeah, like
upon
if the frame is
evolution,
changing while you're
yeah, yeah,
examining
right,
the system, then that could perhaps have implications for our confusion about the expansion of the universe, for
yeah,
example.
yeah, yeah, no, yeah, I mean, because Einstein had to add that that lambda factor in, and that's kind of that gives rise to this problem of is the universe expanding or contracting? And then, I think the current evidence is that it's going to expand. And then that leads to the problem of dark matter and dark energy, and so it may simply be that we don't have, a subtle enough conception of how historical, the physical world, really turns out to be, and that and that the laws in some sense are not fixed, and that they themselves are subject to time.
Mm-hmm.
What is that expression? Time is the fire in which all things burn, or something like that.
Ooh,
But
nice.
anyway, so that's just one of these other possibilities, which goes back to the ancient philosopher Heraclitus, right? Who you never step into the same river twice. There's this
Mm.
ancient alternative tradition of accepting temporality and historicity as a fundamental element of reality, rather than an image of something that is fixed. Like if you think about what history is, it's this social science, it's this picture, it's an interpretation of things, but there is really a fact of the matter,
Mhm.
and then we're but well, maybe maybe the nature of the facts are historical, and that means that they're not fixed, and
Mm.
that perspective is more profound than we have actually thought. And you had this postmodern development in philosophy, which tries to kind of introduce a radical sense of perspectivism,
Mhm.
and relativity, even
Yeah.
for
On a
historical,
personal level, I find it
social, and
challenging.
yeah,
I
right,
tend toward more of an objectivist, more moral
yeah,
philosophy, and
yeah,
I would love to talk about that for 3 more hours. But
yeah, I
instead,
mean,
let's pull
that's
into the present and just and sort of button its historical journey with what's on your plate right now. What kind of things you focus on? Are you in a
yeah,
teaching phase of your career right now? What are you doing in Portugal and Sweden? What's
yeah.
going on?
So I mean, after graduate school, I published a number of things on this question of the reconciliation of relativity and quantum theory. It was a sort of a general picture of how it might work. My colleagues then developed that into books and took it much further. But I don't know, at the end of my career, I just kind of became disillusioned by the conservatism of my discipline
Hmm.
in philosophy and physics. And I wanted a broader experience and knowledge of philosophy, in the hope that maybe would help me approach or reapproach or rethink science in not radical. I don't want to sound like over the top, but more fundamental ways. How science is a human act. It's
Hmm.
not just this, we like to talk about scientific method as if it's this, objective thing. but it's a very human process, which is, of course, saturated by culture and value, and it is a historical process. And that's something that we find hard to accept because, we like to think of science as tracking some kind of objective reality and truth. But again, maybe reality is a bit more subtle than we would like to think. So I branched out, and I started to sort of study the philosophy that I didn't have a chance to study in graduate school. So the Hegelian tradition, for example. I got deeper into the Immanuel Kant was, of course, one of the major reference points in my studies, as well as David Hume, the great empiricist. But very little philosophy after that of the historical great figures did we really study. So I was really frustrated by that, and I realized that there was this whole tradition that I didn't really experience or hadn't encountered. So I started studying, Hegel and the post-Kantian sort of idealist tradition, Fichte and Schelling and all of these German philosophers, which I really love. I love that stuff. Really heavy, hard to read, impossible sentences, and then Nietzsche, of course, later on. So I kind of expanded, my palette of understanding, and I read Marx. I got into sort of Marxism for a while. I abandoned that, more or less. I still read Marx as a critic of capitalism without being a Marxist, in terms of solutions. But and I studied politics and history and political economy. Those are other sort of interests of mine, as well, and history. So I kind of I moved away from that, and I published, in other areas, and I wrote, a crazy a crazy piece about the possibility of a transformation in the method of science, by thinking of it in terms of a kind of an art, and I was trying to imagine a different way of formally representing reality without strict mathematics, but a more general framework that made contact more with not just the visual senses, which is what mathematics really is, a very visually sort of oriented representational system, but music. Music, which is much more emotional. It's of course it's of the ear, and not of the eyes. And so I thought, in some future possibility, if we were to expand outside of the visual tradition that goes from Plato, all the way through Newton and Einstein, it's math and science are very bound up together with geometry and visualization. Of course, algebra makes it, easier to be much more abstract. But, we're trying to model what we see and what we experience. That's really what physics, in a sense, does. We might not say that, but that's, I think that's what the ground of science is. That's where it comes from. It's a kind of model of our experiences, of the phenomenology of how things appear and how they will unfold in the future, and where they've come from in the past. So it's very much rooted in experience, but yet the experience is very narrow. I mean, it's just space, time, and material qualities. It's a very much narrowed space. You look at the Middle Ages, it was a much more expansive kind of thing. Aristotle's system was much, much more complicated in terms of causes and what could be acceptable ways of explaining the world. But we kind of lost all of that in favor of, these, physical sort of qualities. And, as a consequence, consciousness and human experience kind of disappears from the physical description of the world. And perhaps, we're at the limit of that now. And science is kind of entering into this period of stasis where, the very thing that it needs, which is, a kind of more, a more of an engagement from the side of experience and human consciousness. This is what, science, in a sense, is missing. And therefore, it perhaps is entering a period of a sort of innovation crisis. I mean, there's talk about, how there's an innovation crisis in progress in science, that it's kind of coming to a stall. And that may be the case. And I think that, that element of human experience and consciousness is what is perhaps, many people are saying this, I mean, is what is missing. My problem is that the solutions that people offer, I think, are sometimes worse than the disease, but that's another question. So I expanded out from there, and tried to kind of come to science from a totally different perspective, which even from my own point of view was kind of strange. I wanted to kind of, how can I put this? I mean, I guess in German, what I wanted to do is I wanted to transform, I wanted Entfremdung. I wanted science to be estranged from me. I wanted to see it in a weird way, so that I could see it in a fresh way, you know what I mean? To make it strange, so that it can kind of become something new. Because that's the problem, is it's too familiar, and we get stuck in the methodological traditions that we have. So I wrote this weird paper, on the possibility of music as a new kind of science. And that kind of completes my my sort of the immediate history. And then, I wasn't sure what to do, for a few years, until, I came upon the UAP thing that happened in 2021. And I was sick with COVID. I had a lot of time on my hands, and I had a heart issue that was a result, we think. I mean, it's a hypothesis. We think happened as a result of my getting COVID very early in 2020 with the Delta wave. I had pericarditis. It was horrible. I was hospitalized multiple times for a month. Yeah, it was awful. I had fevers, and it was like we didn't know what the hell was going on. But anyway, I was recovering in the hospital, and I randomly, YouTube gives me, Theories of Everything podcast interview with Kevin Knuth.
Okay, yeah. You're saying you got
Mongo.
radicalized by the algorithm, by the way.
Yeah, right. Yes, this is the thing, and I just listened, and I was like, a NASA scientist talking about, and I didn't really know at that time. I didn't know of the 2017, New York Times. I had no idea.
Ooh.
And I'm listening to Kevin talk, and I just can't believe what I'm hearing. I'm like, am I really hearing this?
And Kevin's a physicist. His some of his focus has been on the propulsion qualities of some of these
exactly.
objects.
And
he's done some really interesting work. He's got a good Soul Foundation video people can watch.
Yeah. And he's part of my organization.
Heck
as
yes.
Well.
All right.
And
you reached out.
He has his talk from last year is, I don't know if it's on YouTube or not. It's on the website, but he did a talk again for us this year. Anyway, we can talk about the organization later. But
well, let's just linger then on this moment of ontological shock, because that's something that I like to check in with people going through this. Right. How are you doing? How is this unfolding for you? Has it been rocky? Is it exciting?
Yeah, so
strange.
So I had an indication that some people were taking this seriously back in I can remember when it was. When I was in graduate school, I remember having a conversation with my mentors in physics and philosophy. And I remember them telling me something about, hey, so there's this group out in Texas. It turns out, I think I never fully confirmed it, but I'm pretty sure it was Eric Davis and Hal Puthoff's, what the hell did they call that? In fact, I know one of the guys of that group, Michael. I'm blanking. But anyway, it was. I'm sure it's the Hal Puthoff. It was the what did they call them? Institute for Advanced Studies at Austin. I think it was that. I didn't know that at the time, but I came to learn that in fact was probably where my colleagues heard about this. But anyway, that they had been in Texas, and they were at a physics conference, and straight standard physics, theoretical, heavy duty theoretical physics thing, and And they tell me, I don't know, we got talking, and they're like, hey, I met these people, and they're talking about UFOs, and they're talking serious about it. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, they're actual physicists, and they're taking the question seriously. And what struck me as really interesting and kind of scary in a way at that time, back in '07, was the fact that they're like, hey, look, let's drop all the BS and let's just assume that people are telling the truth about what they're seeing. Just like whatever the hell you want to call it, flying saucer, whatever the hell they're seeing, orbs, whatever it is. Now Tic Tacs, right? Cigars, whatever. Let's just assume there's enough of a pattern here that you've got a seemingly physical anomaly. You got objects moving at crazy speeds on radar and everything. How the hell are they doing it? And that's how they put it to me. My colleague said that's the way that they're approaching it. They're like, let's just assume that there's enough there that the stories are fairly, indicative of a structure of kinematical or velocity acceleration facts that we can start wondering, so how could something like that be possible? Maybe it's not real, whatever, but let's assume that these people are telling the truth. We'll work on that assumption. Again, maybe it's false, but let's assume that it is. That's how you do it in science. Let's do the homework problem. How the hell are they doing it? And I was like, I was really intrigued by the fact that, you had actual physicists, not just not like, crazy burst into a lecture hall. I've seen zeta reticulans, and, they've told me the answers, and, no, it was like, it's just, let's figure this out. I was like, really? And I just couldn't believe it. So I just, that just left my mind. I didn't think about it. I didn't think about it again until 2021 when I'm in the hospital listening to Kevin describe the calculations that he made in this paper, the 2019 paper he did with, Robert Powell and other people from SCU, who did, SCU, which, is the organization that was responsible for publishing, a 220 page report on the Nimitz case, which then I learned about through Kevin and this paper.
And this is SCU is the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. That's right. Okay, just wanted to flag that for people.
And disclaimer, I'm a what do you call a contributing member to SCU.
Great.
I know all those guys very closely. I have very good communications with all of them. They're all fantastic individuals. Robert Powell is my hero, along with Rich Hoffman. I really respect those guys like highly. Sarah Littles is kind of in behind the scenes, the science advisor. She's absolutely top notch, fantastic PhD in science. Anyway, so I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Hell, I'm listening to Kevin and I just can't believe what I'm hearing. And so I download, I find that damn paper. I'm like, I download it, I print it out right away, and I sit with my pencil, and I'm like, I can't put it down,
Cool.
And I hadn't had that feeling, I like having that feeling, like there's something real here. I got to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah.
So I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever. Maybe there's a lot of bullshit that people say about it. Of course, yes. Eyewitness testimony is shit. And then in certain cases, of course, it's unreliable. We know this. Okay, fine. But let's get down to brass tacks. You've got pilots. You've got radar reports. You've got, naval officers. You've got people. There's no freaking reason, that they want to lie. There was no publicity out of this stuff back then. So what the hell? Let's take it seriously. What are the calculations that you can do based on phenomenological reports? Okay, yes, the data is shitty, of course. In science, we know that. But it's enough to go on to calculate what are we dealing, what's the performance envelope, as they say. And when I read, those calculations in the 2019 paper, I'm like, okay. either, the memory is really shitty in these pilots, and they really didn't see what they said they saw, or there's something profoundly enigmatic here, and what the hell is behind it. So that was that, that there is that moment of shock, and you're like, what is doing it? Why? What's the intention? What the hell kind of, physical principles allow an object of 40-foot long, approximately, minimum of 1,000 kilograms, to go 45,000 miles an hour at the halfway point, undergoing a maximum of, 5 to 6,000 G forces? I mean, what? With a maximum power output that's like, 10 times the total energy output of, the nuclear facilities in the United States. You got to be kidding me. In a quarter of a second. That's the Nimitz, right? The case reported by Kevin Day. So I was like, okay, wait a minute. So I'm like, I have to, I'm like, I'm sorry. This has got to take priority over absolutely everything. There's, and so then from there, what I did, what academics, what we do, we go to the references and we start reading. I've read from A to Z, everything in there I downloaded or looked up, or, when I started to realize that there is a core of very compelling cases that present with these profoundly anomalous characteristics, for which, the conventional explanations of hoaxes and malperception and instrument error don't necessarily apply. Although you can, we always know, I'm a philosopher of science, I know this. You can always make any set of data consistent with any set of assumptions about the way the world is. You just have to, you can make it fit. And I understand that that's the logic is that you should prefer the simplest explanation with the fewest additional assumptions that don't challenge any of your basics, like how physics presumably would work, which would explain the data. You want to do that, yes, but okay. But an officer, Dave Fravor, I saw the thing, it was hovering, and he says it looks like a ping pong ball in a glass jar, and then it comes up to my freaking, it engages me. I saw it with my own eyes. My officers saw it, and it did the following things. Mm-hmm. And then the Nimitz officers said X, Y, and Z about what they saw in their radar scopes. The guy was vectored to the thing in coordinates in physical space. Fravor was sent there by a radar pilot to see it. It was bouncing energy off of whatever the fuck, I mean, look, we can go through a billion, we can take the little go fast thing, like Mick West does. We can find an explanation. Surely that is, of course, perfectly reasonable. But in the context of explanation, in which that video, for example, it has to be framed to give me a complete explanation that does not require a conspiracy of malperceptions and errors that happen at the same time,
which complicates
that I find that unconvincing. I'm sorry. I don't have an explanation for it, but that's fine. You don't need to. What you need to have is to have established an indication of a kind of phenomenology in physical space for which science, is not, or physics has a hard time to accommodate. That's all you do. You need an indication of something real that requires the setting up of a research program to get the data that is of a sort where we're not debating the quality and the integrity of the data, but we're rather debating conclusions that can be drawn on the basis of that data.
Well, so this is a great transition now into your vision for UAP studies as a field. And maybe you can talk, as you do at the beginning of Limina, your journal, which we'll get to in a little bit, about the way you see UAP studies as distinct from and sort of a next step from ufology as classically understood.
Yeah, that's precisely correct. So, so what I had to do was first I had to engage myself in this world, and I had to learn. Okay, I mean that's what we do. Academics do that. Anybody does that. It's not just academics. I got to learn the field. I got to learn what the hell there is. I have to understand the landscape, and I got to go from the way I work is I go from the foundation up. So I had to get the history. I got, who the hell is Hynek? Who is Jacques Vallée? Who are these people? What did they write? What did they say? So I started to get anything and everything I could, but the way that I operate is if I want to know something and there's an organization that does it, I call the president. I don't. I call the person who's in charge. So I emailed absolutely everybody. I emailed SCU. I emailed QFOS. I emailed any organization that I saw was credible. Sincere, and which had a kind of a track record that I could sort of measure. And I wanted to involve myself and help and just like learn. So, and Robert Powell and everybody, they reached out to me. It was great. I had some ideas we exchanged and they got me involved and showed me how. And then I started reading everything that they wrote. I read the entire Nimitz report. These things, I just can't put it down, it's so compelling. I read the Aguadilla thing, that one, maybe there's a little bit more room for debate, but I still find it compelling. Then the Stephenville case, which Robert really did a fantastic job on. I read their stuff and I was convinced, yeah, SCU, that's the way to go. That's, if you want to really do a hardcore study and of this stuff, you gotta go that way. And then I learned about QFOS, the Center for UFO Studies, which was the legacy of, that's the legacy of Alan Hynek. And I reached out to Mark Rodiger, who is the current director. And that's where it started. I talked to Mark. I still talk to Mark all the time, but I called Mark every week for about a year. And Mark is, I can't sing the praises of this gentleman enough. He is the most sober-minded, the most grounded, the most careful, the most systematic, methodical, scholarly student of this subject that I have encountered. He is the other protege, right? There's always like this, right? Freud had like 3 main proteges, everybody knows Jung.
Yeah.
Some people know Adler and nobody knows Wilhelm Reich,
Okay.
It's always like that, right? You have these great students and, these proteges, and only some become famous. The others are not.
So Rodiger is the protege of
Alan Hynek.
Oh,
He's the other, there were 2. I mean, there are others. I mean, there are some others, but I know, I mean, Mark, I say Mark as the second to Vallée, because Vallée, of course, everybody in the UFO world knows who he is. Of course, famous. I mean, he's in Close Encounters, or supposedly. Although there's the alternate interpretation that Mark Connell, who did Hynek's biography, says that it's actually Claude Boyer, the other French theorist that might not know about.
Okay, picking some straws here.
The mentor of Vallée, but Vallée gets angry when you say that. But anyway, I'm not an expert there. But anyway, so there are 2. Vallée is one, but of course there is then Mark Rodiger, who really held the ship when Hynek went off to Arizona towards the end, or was it Arizona or New Mexico? I think it might have been New Mexico, towards the end of his life, as he was sick with cancer, and turned over the reins of the center to Mark, who has held the steering wheel, since 1980 something, 87 or 88, and has done, really important work, on electronic interference cases. Mark wrote the book, basically, that everybody has to use on UFO electronic interference cases. I don't know, maybe you haven't come across that one yet,
I
but
haven't. No.
famously, right, it's even in 2000, or it's even in 2001, it's even in
Close
Close
Encounters.
Encounters,
Yeah, they shut down the
and
car, for example.
when the
This is a
lights go
common
out. Well, Mark,
phenomenon. I didn't
yeah,
realize
he
Mark had
he
written a book
authored
around it.
he authored the book on that, and the center published it. They published a number of texts. It's hard to find because you got to call the center to get the texts. It's not exactly in the library, but there are a number of studies and case reports and so on that the center published, which are quite valuable. A lot of that material is being turned over, I think, to David Marler. I don't know if you know David Marler.
Yep.
David Marler, he's like, it's interesting how some of the, when you learn the field, and start reading in more deeply, you realize certain people focus on certain things. So David Marler is the triangular UFO guy. Like,
Okay,
he's the
great.
guy who has studied every case involving a triangular UFO. Like,
Somebody's on the triangles. That's good to know.
he wrote the book. He literally wrote the book. But Dave Marler had in his home one of the largest UFO archives in the world, which now has become the National Historic Center for UFO Archives, and it's now, I think, in a separate facility out not too far from where he lives in New Mexico. And a lot of people are sending a lot of archival materials to him, and he's another one of these like super dedicated guys who's cataloging and preserving all of this for scholars, to go and look at. Anyway, so
yeah, so you're reaching out to these people, you're making these connections.
Yeah. So
and you start to get like a vision of a field here, and do you have something to do with, or did you found, excuse me if this is an ignorant question, but the Society for UAP Studies?
That's me.
That's you. Okay, so you found this organization. With the idea of bringing people together to study this.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, what anyone who studies it with an even, sober mind realizes is, look, okay, there are a range of when you look at the case reports and witness testimony, there's a range of experiences that are being had. And some are just like, like the Hynek scale, like the daylight disk, and the nocturnal lights. And then you have the close encounter stuff. And then, you have the encounters where they're at 500 to 1,000 feet, and then they get closer and closer, and it gets weirder. Tends to get weirder as these objects get closer to people. And then there's a range of things that people say that they see, sometimes at a distance, sometimes also up close. And then you have this abduction stuff, right, which I consider to be in a separate category, although within the abductions, I would say that there are two kind of classes, the one where, hey, I saw a guy waving at me in a window kind of thing, which is something you hear in some cases, like the Papua New Guinea father. Oh, I forget the priest's name. There's a famous case where, there's this like freaking saucer in the sky, and there's, people there, and they
seeing
wave,
figures that
and they
are
wave back.
Yeah, on Hynek's scale of close encounters. I forget which number it is, but it's on the scale.
Yeah,
But
it's like
full-on interaction,
500,000.
abduction. That's not on Hynek's scale as I remember it. That's kind of a next level, a different place to go.
Yeah, the close encounter. Yeah, like people have added new encounter levels.
Okay.
Right. The fourth kind, I think, is the abductions, and then there's supposed to be the fifth, CE5, which is I can call them up at at will kind of thing.
Got it. If that turns out to be real, it will be very interesting.
Yeah. So, but anyway, so yeah, Hynek, he talks about that, but that, he doesn't tend to focus so much on that. Not that it's, that he's dismissing it or anything, but those are a little harder, those cases. But so you quickly, there's a range of stuff happening, and and correspondingly, the level of credulity goes up. I mean, because of how strange it gets, which is normal. It's so so what, but anyway, the point I was making is that when anybody starts digging around deeply with a clear head, you realize there's a lot of stuff mixed in with the experience, and you're not sure of what is going on, all the time. It's easy when someone says, hey, I just, on the radar, I saw this object do the following thing, which implies a speed of 16,000 miles an hour.
Right. Just
And
nuts
then,
and bolts, hard.
yeah, and a
clear.
cop says, I saw it too, like the Illinois case in 2000, which David Marler talks about extensively in his book, which turns out to be a triangular UFO. You had radar reports, indicating, ridiculous speeds. I mean, and then cops in different districts saying, yeah, I saw the same thing. The thing is like this, I don't know, like 200-foot triangle thing moving
Okay.
around. Okay, it's weird. It's very strange, but it's it's something that you can say it happened probably, and it presents a mystery in terms of the physics behind it, and what the hell it presents itself as a kind of technology that seems a little bit easier to deal with than when someone says I was abducted at 4 o'clock in the morning by these creatures and it was only me.
Mhm.
And then maybe somebody saw some lights or something. So like, there's a range of things that, kind of, is it intersubjectively real or is it a subjective encounter? And the more, the less intersubjective it is, the more we're now in the realm of it was an experience. Okay. Was it an experience that had an objective component? In other words, did the person travel outside of their room into a craft with beings as responsible agents or not? Well, it's hard to assess that because there's often very little corroborating evidence.
Is
And
that
then,
what you meant by intersubjective? Like if there are multiple people
precisely,
experiencing these
right.
events, then okay, cool. We can kind
Yeah,
of
multiple
give them
people
a
plus
reality
like,
shape.
yeah, maybe like instruments that are also
Okay,
involved, like
sensors.
radar or photographs or whatever.
And each
Like, and then it's,
layer kind of points to the next one, you could say, from like an epistemological standpoint.
right.
Once you have some grounded reality, like the Department of the National Intelligence, or Director of National Intelligence says, okay, some of these things are real physical
Yeah.
objects, got them on sensors. Okay, well, so that gives you kind of a reason to look
Yeah.
deeper at some of the things that you don't have easy explanations for or great intersubjective data about. And that can go all the way to the really weird stuff.
Yeah, right.
And at least give you like a valid starting point for investigating it, like a reason to do so.
And that's what I saw as the problem, right? Which is that, as I learned the landscape of stuff, surely there's a lot of hoax, there's a lot of misperception or human malperception,
Sure.
instrument
And there's
error.
some drifting, yeah.
Yeah, of course, there's all of this, but the more carefully documented cases for which there are corroborating components to it, multiple witnesses plus, radar or other physical evidence on record, points to a sort of certain common structure of the experiences, which indicates a kind of reality for which it is hard to find a conventional explanation. So I quickly realized that even though there's a lot of crazy stuff in there, there is a core of compelling cases for which there ought to be some kind of systematic effort to study. And that's what you realize didn't really happen much. And then the question is, so what the hell was going on or had been or has been going on in the UFO world? Well, that's an interesting question because of the stigma, because of the insistence on explaining it away with conventional assumptions. The investigation of the phenomenon got caught in a cul-de-sac of essentially of cold case sort of forensic, cold case chases. Right?
Yeah, this is your coinage. This forensic ufology.
Forensic cold case chases. And the event happened, the witnesses either are present or when you talk to them again, they're going to change elements. We know that that's how memory functions. So you're always trying to recover. So what happened and what was it, Is it aliens? Was it, but this is like a ridiculous cul-de-sac because the evidence is usually, again, it's cold. You can't, there's no thing, you can't go in the sky and see it again, generally.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't usually happen. It usually are these one time off events that maybe a few witnesses say they saw, or like the Nimitz case, multiple people seeing it. It's on sensors. There were multiple officers involved, but it's gone. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't exist. It's poof. It's not
Yeah.
there anymore. And we don't know of any cases that exactly replicate the Nimitz encounter. I mean, there are some objects that answer the description of a tic tac, yes, but so it's a very fraught landscape of evidence. And what I eventually realized is that the two things. I mean, one, there is no discipline as such to sort of frame, the study of this phenomenon in any sort of systematic way, whether it be the empirical study of the phenomenon or the more experiential, sort of subjective aspects of the phenomenon. It really doesn't exist. So what you do have is scholars who will approach it from their respective fields, which is to a certain extent, it's fine. So you have historians maybe looking at it, anthropologists looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
It's all fine. But the problem is that the typical maneuver there is that they bracket the question of the reality of the object, the subject, the thing that they're studying, and so you're not going to get any resolution or answer on the question of, so if there's a history of this subject, what is the history a history about? Greg Akegian, for example, one of our colleagues at the society, just as honest, it is the history of the human dealings with this phenomenon, about which we don't really fully understand the nature, origins, and so on. So for him, it's fine that it's a cultural phenomenon, which is a mixture of hoaxing, of objects that are unidentified, of the government, of private investigators, of cults, of organizations trying to study it in some way, or sharing stories, or things like that. So, and that's fine. So, but what I realized is that, and there is really no subject called UAP studies. I mean, it simply doesn't exist. And the very idea that you would have a subject, a discipline or something configured around such a subject is, I think, before now, it would have been considered, completely absurd. And so that's number one. And number two, more specifically, when you're looking at the empirical study of the phenomenon, what you had always, the default move, whenever anybody got interested in it at the government level or academia, and there are cases, in the 60s and 70s, there some academics took it seriously, and the government commissioned, as we know, Edward Condon, they commissioned a study of the phenomenon to see if there's anything meriting further investigation, etc. But what did that turn out to be? What did most of these things turn out to be? They turned out to be forensic investigations, in other words, cold case chases. So if you read the memoirs of the people that were involved in like Roy Craig, for example, who has a fantastic book on his involvement with the Condon study, which I really recommend people read. If you're interested in it, you of course read Condon, the report, but and you have to read the critique that McDonald did, Science and Default, a classic, text. But you have to read like the memoirs of the people who actually did the study, because then you actually see what happened. And what they did was, it's the Fox Mulder and and Dana Scully thing, right? There was a case, and they get a phone call in the middle of the night, and they're like, okay, you got to go out there, and so, they'll get paid to go out to Texas, and at 4:00 in the morning on the next flight, and so they rush out there, and and they bring their gear, and then they take notes, but it's you're chasing, what do you don't even know what the hell you're chasing. You're chasing stories. You're chasing ghost stories or whatever. So it's this forensic hunt that is always retrospective. It's always after the fact. And you're trying to reconstruct the scene of a crime. It's forensic. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is you're never going to have a definitive, it rarely will you have a definitive result from such a kind of structure of investigation, especially, right? I mean, at least in criminology, you can take the results of your forensic investigation. You've got a whodunit problem. And, you've got police, you've got a court, you've got, maybe you can bring a witness, or you've got a suspect, and you can have a trial, and you got a judge, and then they weigh the evidence, and then they could issue a conclusion based on a jury's evaluation of the evidence, right? Did the person do it or not?
So there's an end point. There's a structural system in place to weigh a judgment.
For UFOs, good luck with that. I mean, so who was the tribunal here? I mean, it's just a ridiculous proposition. The ridiculous proposition is that we can either affirm or deny the reality of the UFO phenomenon based on these inconclusive sort of forensic cold case chase. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So the whole idea behind the Condon
direction of further research.
Exactly. So the whole idea behind the Condon report is just like I mean, they only gave it 100,000, maybe 200,000 bucks. Okay, it's a lot of money in 1968, but come on. I mean, really? I mean, it's just so
it was scandal plagued. We should say he wrote this memo to his coworker, maybe Loeb or something, in which he says, the trick will be to make this seem like a serious investigation, while in fact doing nothing of the kind, basically. Reaching a foregone conclusion. And some of his researchers resigned in protest because they thought basically it was bullshit and he wasn't taking it seriously. And then when the report came out, a lot of the body of the report includes some serious research that some of these scientists thought pointed in an interesting direction. But Condon's thumbnail takeaway from the whole thing was nothing to see here. Let's move on. And science collectively largely did move on. They said, okay, great. Nothing to see here. We checked. And so, 50 years have gone by and there's been no serious, rigorous investigation. But now that's finally starting to change. And your frame of this as UAP studies points in a new direction away from the forensic cold cases of ufology. And to some extent, maybe away from sort of the squishier stuff of cultural investigation, but maybe part of what I took away from your description of this in your journal is that you see this as an interdisciplinary project, but drawing these things away from their native disciplines to collectively start to build a vocabulary and a structural approach together to investigate this further from multiple angles. Does that sound right?
Yeah. That's exactly correct. So because we don't really know the full extent of what the hell it is that we're dealing with. And so we have to be prepared for a number of more exotic possibilities. On the more extreme end, we have to be prepared, for the possibility that there is an agency, with which, in some cases that we're interacting with. And science doesn't really like studying agency because we don't like when the thing we're studying can think on its own.
Or evade us or confuse us.
And especially if it's an intelligent agency. We don't have a science, except for anthropology, we don't have a science that studies intelligence that is not essentially human. I mean, okay, we have animal intelligence, it's true, but not at the level of technological wielding.
Right. That's the thing we've never done before.
We don't have that.
But I did want to flag here something I've been thinking about a lot, which is I was wondering if you've reached out to any field researchers who do work with intelligent animals. Like gorillas come to mind, other apes, chimpanzees, orangutans. is it maybe what it could it potentially be interesting in this interdisciplinary way to like talk to some of those
For
people
sure.
about principles they have for yeah, tracking intelligent species,
Yeah.
and because some of this is going to be field work, and to your point, nothing really comparable exists in the animal world, but it is kind of the closest analogy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it surely has to be, and I think those who study more sophisticated forms of intelligence, I mean, there are the sort of antisocial forms like the octopi, the cephalopod. They're very interestingly unique creatures, to the more social sorts of sophisticated intelligence that you find in dolphins,
Mm.
and whales, and their worlds are they're very alien, quite frankly, to us, and so a lot of a number of researchers have remarked, especially in the astrobiology world, that is a tradition that is concerned with extraterrestrial intelligence, and that is where it is not taboo to speak about it. It's always been remarked that if you want to understand extraterrestrial intelligence, well, you firstly have to study and understand very well the varieties of terrestrial intelligence. We're just discovering that perhaps there is an alphabet, in some whales forms of speech.
Wow.
And some possible, kind of like alphabetic linguistic structures there that are being communicated, which is would be radically amazing.
Yeah, that's extremely exciting.
Yeah, and so so that's kind of another thing that I want to emphasize, is that this UAP studies, as opposed to ufology, which always looked to in a way at the alienness, that there was that there's this alien intelligence there, or that it's a physical phenomenon, or nuts and bolts, or whatever it is that is technological in nature. It sort of leapt towards the non-human, perhaps too fast. I mean, what I see at UAP studies is very thoroughly grounded in first working through the human and the terrestrial. And that's what I see as the foundation, for example, of the empirical study of UAP, the empirical branch, if you will, of UAP studies, which looks at these as objects in physical and psychological space, as being real, but first, in order to understand what it is, we have to understand what it is not. And in order to understand what it is not, we have to understand what it is that 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 the that that is a human reality, and is the reality of the earth. We have to understand the earth. We have to understand what is in the sky. We have to understand what is in near earth orbit. We have to understand also a bit outside of that, into the solar system. We have to understand the surface of the earth. We have to understand sea. We have to understand the oceans.
One of
In
the
other words,
scientists in the NASA panel suggested a metaphor of like, if you want to find a needle in a haystack, you have to be able to describe the haystack,
and
or
the
you
hay
have to
in
be
that
able to
stack.
describe the needle extremely well. And since we don't know how to do that, we're gonna have to come up with all these
So
for the hay.
yeah, that's right. So that's what I'm working on with my colleague Wes Waters, who is also at the society with us, who is also a part of the Galileo project, one of the premier members, I think, of that group, who are doing the real scientific groundwork, which is establishing a rigorous and multimodal understanding of the terrestrial parameter space. To put it in, as abstract and general a way as possible, we need to understand, what it is that's already there, right? Which we can describe and can categorize, and is within, conventional parameters. And then, once we have an integral perspective of the terrestrial landscape of physical events, then we can start to understand against that what would constitute an anomaly within that parameter space. That's one way of approaching it, right? I mean, that's so it's but that's a hard project, right? Because it, just read, the Galileo Project's 2023 paper where they describe exactly what it is that they're doing, and they put forward this notion of a science traceability matrix in which you have events that can be traced across modalities, whether it be sound, seismic detection, electromagnetic detections, and then various parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, acoustical, magnetic, anomalies, electrical disturbances, et cetera, et cetera. We need but in order to understand what's anomalous, we have to understand kind of what the baseline is. And no one's really, I mean, different sciences in a sense have an understanding of that. Like for example, I mean, atmospheric sciences and climatology, I mean, they kind of know the baseline versus the anomaly, right? They have a picture of that. Geologists have a certain picture. Seismologists have a certain, but this is again another example of the radically interdisciplinarity that UAP studies is. We need to integrate these various scientific understandings into a radically comprehensive picture of the total terrestrial parameter space, so that we understand what it is that we can comprehend within the well understood parameters of scientific understanding so far, right? We can get that picture, but that's a hard task. And Galileo Project shows exactly how hard it is, because it is multimodal. It is trying to integrate from different instrumentations, different instrument suites. You're trying to integrate into a picture that gives you a sense of what's going on the planet Earth. Right.
And it seems like a very significant part of this challenge is just getting the people to talk to each other, getting the disciplines, more broadly to talk to each other, but getting the human beings who are doing this work connected. So something that your society does really well is you've got like a member portal function that aspires to unify and make it easy for these people to connect and chat. And that connects to a couple other challenges in this space, which include funding, a challenge for any space, I would imagine, and a unified approach to specifically the field study and the sensor science that's starting to evolve. Another big thing that came up in the NASA panel report in 2023 was the subject of sensor calibration. And I thought maybe as somebody who's helping facilitate a collective approach to this, you might have an opinion on like how hard that really is. How hard is it to establish like a unified body of preferences and like technical specs that everybody can kind of agree on when they're building sensors, and how they should, like, how can we even think about creating a sensor calibration system? Is that difficult, or is it
I mean,
and that seems from the outside?
I can only speak. Firstly, I mean, I can only speak generally about the problem. I am not a scientist. I am not a practicing scientist. I'm a philosopher of science. Yes, I can talk about methodology and so on in a general way, but these are sort of very specific issues that are faced by professional scholars in science, in the sciences, and especially with respect to the construction and deployment of instrumentation, which requires a great deal of training and so on. I do not have that, so I have to preface my comments with that disclaimer. But what I can tell you, I mean, I interface with that community. Of course, I am in contact with Wes Waters and other people from the Galileo Project. Kevin Knuth also, I also consider him a friend, and other people in this field. It is hard because there is no common framework. I mean, you're right to pick up on that. There is no common framework, I should say, for specifically studying UAP, because we're still trying to figure out what it is, what the structure of phenomena is that we are trying to study. And so that kind of, that brings us, back to the earlier point that I was making in the transition from the classical ufological tradition of cold case chases to the new, what I call the new science of UAP, which is in this broader category of UAP studies. It's kind of the empirical branch of that. The transition is now from sort of retrospective, whodunit cases to setting up a research program which is anticipating the phenomenon prior to it happening, right? Or sending a suite of instruments to a place where it is occurring with some regularity. And believe it or not, there are a few cases in which that has happened. The
Like a field team has gone out and a phenomenon has recurred and they've been able to capture some data about it.
Exactly. So today, there are the Tedesco brothers who have set up their instruments in the at Robert Moses Beach in, I guess it's kind of Western Long Island.
Yeah,
in New York.
Mentioned them actually. The first thing I used your platform for was to message one of these others actually.
Yeah, they're really awesome. You should reach out to them more. Really interesting stuff going on there. And so that's kind of like an active attempt to anticipate as something a unidentified aerial or anomalous phenomena that are occurring with some degree of regularity. So, but that's just one, it's one group, and it can't just be the Tedesco brothers. It's got to be other people involved to help them to expand the range of different individuals gathering data in the field. So that's its own challenge, is field work, right? But the point I'm making here is that people like to say that the UFO phenomenon does not repeat, but actually it does, and it has. And there are classic sort of historical sites where it has occurred for many years, and perhaps the most important example from this particular category is the Hessdalen Lights phenomenon, which has occurred, with some degree of regularity. And of course, I say regularity, I mean it repeats in the same general location, but not always specifically in the same place in the sky, right?
Okay.
So
I learned about this
case, there's variability, but there's a geographical kind of concentration, I would say.
And is that part of why you're in Northern Europe? I know you're in Portugal right now, but you've been working in Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interacting with UFO groups, and I'm trying to establish connections in different parts of Europe. So Portugal, of course, I have my colleagues here who are part of ICER and so on. And in Germany, I'm also in Germany. There's IFEX, Hakan Kayal's group there. I maintain connection with individuals related to that project, which is it's a kind of a parallel to Galileo project. They're creating instrument suites for permanent recording of a quadrant of the sky. They have plans to put cameras into vehicles that are actually going to go to Mars. So you might not know this, but the very first UAP tasked camera to Mars is going to be sent on the IFEX payload. This
wow, I didn't know that. That's so cool.
It's very interesting. Andreas Müller, one of our colleagues, has written a piece for his website. I can send you that after we speak. There's links for that. But anyway, so yeah, there's IFEX and so on. Yeah, so I'm forging connections and ties with people here, because in Europe it's a little bit harder to get this thing going. As a kind of a rigorous approach and a serious kind of a treatment of the subject that isn't just cold case chases, but is more sort of forward-looking, anticipatory science, like Galileo project is doing. IFEX, I mentioned at Würzburg in Germany. This is the one and only such thing. Of course, you have the historical, you have the historical ufological sort of groups. You also have perhaps the best, forensic investigatory body ever is probably Japan, or Gaipan, as we say, in France, right? Who have been involved in many of the famous cases that we have on record coming out of France, like the Aix-en-Provence landing case, in 1980, whenever it was, when the farmer sees this crazy saucer thing land in his garden and burn the vegetation, the gendarmerie were sent out and an exhaustive report was done and soil samples, and so it's a classic, example of this sort of forensic follow-up of a case, but they have this sophisticated system in place that, most of us in the English-speaking world do not know about, because they don't exactly publicize themselves in English, but it's a very sophisticated system of examining the possible explanations for these cases and then trying to do follow-up wherever it is merited. But it's still within this paradigm of a sort of forensic model, kind of trying to find what is the most reasonable explanation for a case that has already happened. Okay, fine. But what we really want to do is measure. We want to take measurements. We want active radar. We want, ultraviolet light and infrared sensors. We want particle detectors. We want, radio wave detectors. We want instruments, not only, recording, but to get back to the point that we're making here, but we need a system of calibration and uniformity across suites of instruments. Not only in the Galileo project, they have to coordinate amongst the instruments that they create, but we need a meta organization, a body, deciding on what are the best practices and standards of calibration across the different research groups. The problem is, again, and this is where the cultural history and the cultural and social analysis becomes absolutely crucial, because it affects the science. Because of the stigma attached to studying the phenomenon, which, is really caught in this cul-de-sac of dismissal, but there's no good data. So how can you dismiss without the data? It's all that. No one takes it seriously because, nobody's studying it. Why doesn't anybody study it? Because nobody takes it seriously. It's this kind of stupid, thing that, you saw kind of in a farcical way reproduced within Condon, and then the dismissal happened predictably. Because of the stigma, there are, I can name maybe 5, 3, 4, maybe, actual university-based, research programs who are not only doing the conceptual foundational work to establish the instrumentation that is required. In other words, the modalities that are required to really get good data on which to make good, from which to derive good conclusions. But so not only is there not that, well, then there is also no corresponding agreement among groups, only informally, by the way. I mean, Hakan Kayal, the head of IFEX, talks to, Wes Waters, they exchange, but there's no kind of, body of organizational inter-exchange that is concerned with standards of calibration, and also, by the way, with standards of evidence, in other words, producing the recordings, the instrumentation that are calibrated to produce. There's no standards of evidence on which then to find some, path from the evidence to a conclusion. And we don't know, we don't have that worked out. We haven't talked about the logic of moving from evidence to conclusions. So, and that's something that the astrobiology community about 2 years ago decided we need to change that. We need a clear, standard of evidence that can take us from the data we've collected to a conclusion about there's life, to a process of communicating the results of that when the scientific community of astrobiologists has decided that it is a discovery meriting such communication.
I want to pick up on
the same thing in place for us. I mean,
yeah. So to your point, is astrobiology a more evolved community than UAP studies right now?
Yeah, it is. And, and maybe this is a good time to talk about what the hell I was doing also in Sweden. Well, I was invited by Beatrice Villarroel, who was one of our colleagues at the Society, to do a sort of a visiting, unpaid sort of visiting position at Nordita Institute at the Stockholm University.
Hey, the guy, Beatrice.
Yeah, she's great. She's wonderful. So I mean, it's one of the things which is nice that you can do is, if you have your own, funding and so on, you can go to the institute and you can have an office and interact. And I'm happy to do that. But also I was I was one of Wes Waters, and I asked Wes to join me on a paper, and he graciously accepted. I mean, Wes is absolutely brilliant. I'm always so delighted to be able to work on anything with Wes. I mean, he's just absolutely the top. MIT PhD, he's the best. His talk was accepted, and mine, the one that he and I were doing together. One of the few, many abstracts were submitted to this, believe it or not, an astrobiology conference. It's sponsored by or organized by the European Astrobiology Institute, EAI. They decided to do an exotic location this year. Okay, where did they choose? The Arctic Circle. So and Beatrice had invited me, so it was kind of a wonderful coincidence. So I went there to Stockholm and spent a week or so, and then we went up to West, joined us, and then we went up to Kiruna in the Arctic Circle to do this, I think, actually historic meeting of astrobiologists, where at their conference there were 2 UAP sessions. And the talks that they chose were the one that I and Wes are doing, which is trying to characterize this transition from classical ufology to the sort of what I call the new science, what we call the new science of UAP, in which the cold case chases are ending for the more anticipatory and prospective science of observation and measurement, which is informed by the classical tradition. We're not letting that go. We're not letting that tradition go. It's still important to catalog, receive cases, to examine them, follow up. That all should happen, but that should inform the science. That should not be the science, right? This is a crucial distinction. But so my talk, Wes and I's talk, his talk, which was an exhaustive, beautiful presentation on calibration, instrumentation, and methodology of studying UAP, was a beautiful talk that they needed to hear, because nobody knows what's really going on in this new thing, this UAP studies, the new science branch of UAP studies, because it's all for them UFO, tinfoil hat, aliens are doing it, X-Files stuff. They have no idea that people are starting to take this seriously, and actual people with real positions at universities like which Wes has, Hakan Kayal in Germany, and so on. So they're kind of, they're still squinting their eyes, but I think what they're seeing is, okay, there is a research program here. It's gonna be an uphill battle. It's gonna be expensive. Surprise, science is expensive. But what I could see in the room were that the scientists there could understand what it was that Wes was trying to do. They might not think that it's ultimately worthwhile because we have resource allocation issues. That was a thing that the astrobiology community, of course, had to deal with, still has to deal with. It's like, why would we devote resources to something very hypothetical? There's no evidence that there's any life outside of the planet Earth, quite frankly. There's some indication in the solar system, but surely not extrasolar system, right? Anyway, why should I, give you tens of millions of dollars? So it's always been a kind of a hodgepodge group of SETI people and biology people, which is finally, in the past 15 years, has solidified, or I should say crystallized into a field, a radically multidisciplinary field, which is devoted to the search for, let's say it, ET. I mean, they're searching for ET.
Yeah. Something the NASA panel does really well a couple times is that it sounds a little defensive, but they ping this idea that there's an intellectual continuum, they call it, between searching for technosignatures or biosignatures on an exoplanet, to searching for things nearby like Oumuamua or whatever, to like maybe considering something is happening in our atmosphere. And what they're sort of saying very carefully is like, if you think SETI is reasonable, then it also stands to reason that you might be interested in tracking UAP.
Exactly, and that's a slippery slope that many people have tried, to make, to friction up, to stop. Like Carl Sagan, he has this jump, right?
Yeah, I
hated it. I mean,
pretty frustrated with that because I love Carl Sagan. I'm a big fan of Cosmos. He was wonderful, right. And I don't know if Leslie Kean coined this idea, but Sagan had this great, nifty thumbnail quote that everybody pulls out: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? And I don't know if it's Kane or she's quoting somebody, but she has a beautiful way of turning this on its head, which is that an extraordinary phenomenon requires an extraordinary investigation. And that is something that I was sort of surprised never to hear from Sagan, who mixed it up with a bunch of these people. I was just wondering yesterday if he ever talked to Hynek. Did they have a sit down and drink some whiskey and say, what the heck, man? Why are we looking into this seriously?
That's interesting. I know they knew each other. I don't know the extent to which they engaged with one another, but I know that they did. I mean, they did know each other. I think they maybe even debated, but I'd have to go back and look at the biography. But
I took us far afield there. But
yeah, no, that's fine. But the problem, I mean, Sagan and Sagan in many ways represents the archetypal response of a mainstream sort of scientist with a proper position. But I think there's a lot of, sort of social and cultural baggage that Sagan was trying to battle as he was trying to convince NASA or just the general, scientific community to take SETI seriously.
He was in a way throwing the UFO community under the bus in order to his own
because it was a lightning rod. And it's true. I mean, not being stabilized, which is what the society and many other organizations are trying to accomplish, not being stabilized within an academic discipline and not having a discourse that is accepted and entrenched anywhere in the academy, and having been dismissed and therefore having been turned over to basically a sort of an endless amateur cold case chase, like Storm Chaser kind of thing. He had to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I guess. I mean, he because it was just a lightning rod for all kinds of crazy shit. And anybody who got a whiff of SETI and UFOs being in the same bed, I mean, forget it. I mean, you're not going to get any funding.
Risk.
Yeah, in the 1970s and 60s when they were struggling, So I think it was just like a Machiavellian, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the inner workings of his mind, but it was certainly a pragmatic necessity to distance, because SETI were people in mainstream, science. I mean, trying to come together to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the UFO world tried. I mean, like Hynek and his crowd, there was an attempt to kind of configure that, but then, you had the Condon bomb, and then it just, the cycle of vacuous circular dismissal started again.
Right. And it probably became really hard to get government funding for this stuff, which is important for big scientific projects.
Yeah, right. So so anyway, so that kind of got waylaid. But what was wonderful, it was not only that we were invited and our panel, our sessions were accepted at an astrobiology conference, but also that astrobiologists were present and listening to us and getting a sense that we're not in Kansas anymore. Like I think they're sort of waking up to, oh yeah, maybe ufology is this thing, and there's a kind of a stricter form, and then there's this more loose kind of like let's write books and sensationalize thing. But then, then there's the serious science, which transitions out of that, for which, and this was part of our talk, for which there is historical precedent. I mean, the whole meteorites controversy in the
Rocks don't
18th
fall
and
from the sky.
yeah, right. I
Physically
mean, that's not
impossible.
possible. I mean, scientists even go on record saying it's not possible. It can't happen. Well, that's because they didn't have a framework of you know planetary formation and solar system formation in which it made sense to think that there would be interstellar material that could possibly get caught in Earth's gravity and actually enter the atmosphere. So part of it was a cultural dismissal. It was also, you had a farmer, an uneducated farmer, trying to say, hey, I saw a stone come out. I mean, it sounds crazy, right? So you have the social intelligence system that Ron Westrom, the scholar who studied this, who also studied UFOs in the same vein. You have this problem of receiving the reports, which is just like in the UFO world. You got, people sometimes uneducated, sometimes very educated, saying, extraordinary things. What's that expression, the Stanford, relatively, incredible accounts from relatively credible individuals, that's the kind of thing we get, and so you see the same sorts of social, cultural barriers to trying to take this seriously, as you had, for example, with the meteorite controversy in the 18th and 19th century. And it took a long time, 100 years or so before it was kind of, oh, wait a minute, I guess this is a thing.
Yeah.
But then you think, you could say the same thing about the US, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's like, there's thousands of billions of cameras. Why don't we see it? Well, first of all, you do. And the problem is you don't know what is or isn't a fake.
Yeah.
That's hard. And you can't come to a conclusion about that. It's very difficult. We have the Navy videos. But, guess what? I mean, rocks fell from the sky for tens of thousands, for hundreds of thousands of years. And it took us into the 18th and 19th century to be like, that's a phenomenon, and it's something that science has something to say about. So, I don't buy, all these observations about, well, if it was a real phenomenon, it would have been known,
right.
The same thing was said in about meteorites. I mean, literally the same text was said, so anyway, it's just historical blindness and ignorance to the fact.
To that point, it just while we're near this, I've been wondering if anybody's done any serious research on stigmas and their blinding effect to academic research. And the only thing I can think of that's kind of close is this amazing Thomas Kuhn book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. I'm sure you're familiar, which apparently a lot of scientists didn't love at the time, and some still don't like, because they prefer this incremental progress vision of science. And Kuhn is saying, no, mostly it's like big shuddering shifts between paradigms where you ignore a bunch of anomalies until you can't anymore, and then you enter crisis, you come up with a better framework. That's what's happening right now.
Yeah, and Kuhn was also ambiguous on as to whether there was progress being made. I mean, he was just saying that there are these historical and seismic shifts occasionally, but how do we evaluate the movement from Aristotelianism to Galilean Newtonianism? Is it progress? Well, the problem is, you have the internal evaluation of the results of a science, but you can't evaluate them across paradigms. So Kuhn has this problem where, or the question of as to how segregated these paradigms are in terms of conceptual evaluation, in terms of this question of trans-historical progress. So it was a historical view of science, but what scientists really want is a trans-historical sense that we're moving towards objective truth. And that's where Kuhn was going to be like, well, I don't know about that, but surely there are these changes. Yeah.
Interesting. So have you seen anything by like a psychologist maybe about stigma, like flock behavior around? Because one of they're telling you about the UAP. Once you start going down this bunny hole, you read the Knuth, you read the like serious physics papers, and you start looking around going like, why isn't this more commonly understood? And it seems like there's a big I've given a bunch of this evidence to my friends, and I have this like my paper is vibe when I'm doing it, and they go, I don't know, man, I don't know how to evaluate this evidence, and then
No,
they
it,
just
it
kind of turn the
requires,
page.
like the Buddhists say, what is the value in their ethics? A proper means, upadaya. It requires, a certain approach to get people kind of on board, and then to realize the problems that are being dealt with,
Do
and
you
the
think that
state.
that's a responsibility of the academic community
Yeah,
engaging in UAP studies?
that's part of what pedagogy is, right? I mean, let's just say what it is. I mean, like, the institution of educational institutions function as acculturation vehicles by which, human beings are inducted into particular frameworks of reality. I mean, let's
Yeah.
say what it is. I don't want to say brainwashing, but you come to
No,
learn
very
about.
fancy brainwashing
Yeah, I mean,
and
you come
expensive.
to get a sense of what is accepted as real, and so on, by university training, and then we can analyze that, and critique that, and that's an interesting thing in itself. But the function of pedagogy also is, a gradual sort of systematic exposition of a history of a particular field. I mean,
Mm.
so when I study physics, ideally, unfortunately, this is less the case today. It was not, years ago, but increasingly less today. Physicists do not have a historical grounding in their own subject, which is sad. They have a very like two-dimensional understanding of the history of physics. It's very tragic. But anyway, that's, I mean, part of what we do in especially in philosophy is, we show students that there's a history here unfolding, and that we're at a particular moment in this history, and that there have been these changes and these shifts, as it were. But you go slowly, and you introduce the student to the topic, and show that things have been different in the past, and they are what they are now in the future because of dislocations and shifts in the past. But you have to have that historical grounding, and to give students a context within which to make sense of current developments and things. I mean, that's how I teach, and that's how I see ideally teaching is basically it gives you a context, and it allows you to make sense of sort of the subject within a particular context. And that's the function of pedagogy, and that's certainly going to be true in UAP studies, is that we need to provide an accurate and robustly historical context within which to understand the changes that are happening, and the history of what has gone before. And that's an essential function, and that's what the academy does. You always take courses in history, and hopefully also philosophy and so on, to get a broad sense of how we have thought in the past, and how we are thinking now in the present, and what possibly there is for us in the future. So yeah, I mean, I think that's super important. But who's teaching? Nobody teaches. I mean, at the Society for UAP Studies, we're trying to develop an actual systematic and robustly historical, matrix of academic courses and coursework that can be part of a future degree. So that's also what the academy provides, is training that leads to a degree, which is like a license that says, hey, I'm knowledgeable, I have a level of expertise. And you can go out maybe with the first degree into professional work, but where are you going to do that? And then you study for the master's or the PhD, which is the terminal degree, and then you continue the research to continue the field, to continue progress in the field. We don't have that, right? So another thing that is required is there has to be a discipline. That discipline has to enter into the university, become stabilized with a discourse, a framework of understanding how this thing is studied, what the different branches are of the studies. And then it has to become an and transgenerational process, where you've got students and teachers interacting. The students, then some of them eventually become the teachers, and then it continues from one generation to the next, and traditions start to emerge of ways of studying and ways of approaching it. And that's what you see. You look at in the sciences, even within physics, you have varieties of methods and ways of approaching. And, there are these intricacies that the stability of an institution allows to emerge, somewhat organically. And that creates variety, that creates, fruitful kind of differences. And that's what the conference is for, where these different researchers with their different methods, they come together and they discuss their results. Okay, they all come from having trained in certain basic methods and principles, but they're applying them in interesting ways, and then they communicate with their peers and how they're doing that, and that's how a field not only becomes more mature, but that's progress. I mean, that's how you make progress, is you hand it off to future generations. And that's why, when I'm walking around the Nordita Institute at Stockholm University, or when I recall, my conversations and debates in philosophy of physics and the foundations of physics, we had the blessing of hundreds of years of working out a very precise discourse about the physical world. When we're working from a tradition that goes back many generations. So I traced my graduate student friends and I, we traced the lineage back from our teacher Jeff, who was with Bohm, then through his teacher Oppenheimer, and then it goes back through Gauss, and it went back before him to, ultimately we found it traceable to Leibniz, the great philosopher Leibniz. So, but we were standing in this long tradition of a study of the physical world within a particular tradition that had evolved over the centuries from one student to the next, in sort of this unbroken lineage. And that allows for, this organic, evolutionary development, which promotes, a kind of progress as different traditions and different lineages and different students and their teachers and so on, then they interact and they debate and they share. But we don't have that in UAP studies. So, like Mark Rodiger wants to say, so you want to dismiss UFOs, but I don't have PhD students. I don't have an academic research curriculum. I don't have coursework. I don't have conferences of a serious nature where colleagues are exchanging. You don't give me any money. Okay, great. Have fun with that.
Yeah,
like,
you want to dismiss something you haven't investigated.
Really? Right. So it's crazy. So that's what we're trying to do with the society, is open up that space for the crystallization. And we're helping to hopefully crystallize it, but open up that space where academics can come together so that a proper discipline can crystallize. And of course, one of the most important instruments not only are the conferences, which we've organized, but other organizations have organized very good conferences, like SCU. The Soul Foundation is organizing conferences as well. But the society, aims to kind of stay strictly with scholar, the sort of scholar. And we don't typically invite military people just because they're prominent and they like UFOs, or they think transparency is a good thing, which is fine. I mean, that discourse has to happen. We care about the scholars who they don't just care about UAP, they care about how you need to study it, or they care about how you should approach, for example, like lots of people like to talk about experiencers, right? Well, what's the framework within which the experience or narrative can be understood, received, analyzed, critiqued, etc.? These are the, what I like to think of as the meta-theoretic questions about how to structure the study of a phenomenon like this.
And so someone wrote a good paper about experiencers in your first edition of Limina. Was it Ammon, maybe? Or
Danny Ammon wrote really a paper, I think, about best practices in dealing with when people are trying to kind of communicate, something that they experienced. It wasn't, so I guess, you could say sort of generally it's about sort of best practices in relation to the receipt of reports of what people have experienced.
It seemed like important progress. I also wanted to flag, you just had one of these conferences in August, is that right?
We did, yeah, in the middle of August. Yeah.
Cool.
And
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it went really well. We had a range, like I think there should be. We had people who wanted, to kind of tackle the question of agency and whether there's an extraterrestrial intelligence. If so, then how should we approach that? We had a great French scholar discuss just the very problem that the UFO phenomena is very elusive. It's very hard to kind of situate within the paradigm. He called it the engineer's paradigm, but within the physical science, the science paradigm of observation and experiment. And that's an interesting question, and he wanted to kind of, I think, develop that to be more ontologically significant than I think might be merited. But again, this is a debate between scholars, right? I mean, that's
great.
kind of what we do, but then we had the nuts and bolts people. We had, people talking about instrumentation and data integrity. And we had Gretchen Stahlman, one of our advisors at the Society, who's a fantastic scholar in information data science, who's concerned about communication issues, of course, data integrity, data interoperability, which is kind of the thing you were talking about. It's like we've got data coming in from different platforms, different groups. How do we make them interoperable? How do we make them talk to each other? These are really hard problems. These are problems that serious people need to seriously think about. It's the kind of stuff that NASA, the panel, the really significant NASA panel, that's what they also dealt with. But these are the things that are boring to most people. They just want to hear the Tic Tac story, which is great. It's a great story. But in order to get a
contact in the
project,
desert,
you got to have these, you got to have these foundations, and you got to have people who have the intellectual, even spiritual disposition to have the discipline to be able to do this work. And
the attention,
you gotta have funding. That's another thing you mentioned. And so where is the funding going? Okay, you've got disclosure groups. You've got like the Danny Sheehan thing, the Paradigm Institute. You got money going into disclosure and like getting whatever military secrets out that we can, and then maybe the Soul Foundation, is concerned with policy advocacy, which is really important. But what are we going to write the policy about if we don't have a science? So we also have to lay the foundations for funding for science, for the actual science. Now that's also, I think, what Gary Nolan at the Soul Foundation, he does have ambitions for that, and I believe what he says. I mean, Gary's a brilliant, he's a brilliant scientist. And I really believe what he says, and so I'm hopeful that the Soul Foundation will become, they call themselves Soul, the sun. I really hope they will be a beacon, not only for sort of policy that should be implemented, but really the preliminary work has to be done. Guiding policy, I think, needs to be empirical science and scholarship around the phenomenon, broadly understood.
Is it difficult?
I'm hoping Soul will be a source of funding.
Okay, interesting. And kind of like a beacon that attracts that to other scientific enterprises.
Yeah, absolutely. My concern with Soul, which I voiced in my 30-page review of the conference, which is the last thing I wrote on my blog. I just kind of like, I kind of felt like I'm done for a while writing a blog.
You needed a break after 30 pages.
I'd focus elsewhere. And I found that if I write a blog, like I can't focus on my other academic work and writing and the organization. And I just found it a little bit interfering. So I kind of, maybe I'll write a review of some of the stuff that I've encountered over the past, in the intervening months. But anyway, the concern that I voiced there was that in the wake of the, the sort of bombshell Grush hearing stuff, the Soul Foundation and Gary himself, I think, was nervous. I mean, he voiced his concerns very, very early in an interview when he had the Soul Foundation and had already had his conference. He's like, "Look, I'm putting my reputation behind these people, so yeah, it's like there better be something here."
Mm.
So, and Gary's sincere. And he's brilliant and he's pioneering work in the study of materials, which is absolutely, if the there's kind of two traditions, right, in science. There's the sort of, and we can wax philosophical about them, and there's interesting differences here, but there's the distant observational science of astronomy, right, which is the paradigm of modern, I think, in many ways, of modern science, cosmology and astronomy, right? These are, we observe, and by our observations, we deduce the structure of nature, right? And write down laws of motion. This is Kepler, this is Copernicus. But then there's the experimenting with stuff, right? And, that was always looked down on, believe it or not, right? Because in Aristotle, in the ancient world, you didn't disturb nature. You didn't muck with it. You watched nature kind of show you what the truth was. So it took centuries to kind of start to muck around in nature and do stuff. Like, for example, and then there were religious problems with anatomy. Like, you couldn't open a body, and say, look and see what the fuck, how it's actually working. So you couldn't go inside nature deliberately. It was always this sort of passive, almost like Orpheus, listening, but everything changed in the 17th century, and you had this experimental tradition, right? And so that's the next phase in UAP science, which is this another transition away from just pure observation to, well, guess what? We need some material, like we need stuff. And there are these cases, Gary's paper with one of the first, in a mainstream journal, where he's actually looking at allegedly, ejecta from anomalous, ejecta from allegedly anomalous objects.
Measuring magnesium isotope.
Yeah, exactly. And it's stuff, that we find that in the UFO literature. If you read around, there've been a number of studies done. Vallée talks about it. A lot of people have talked about it. It's a subgenre, in the cold case chase, But here's Gary Nolan talking about, okay, let's do our materials analysis. Let's think about like the instrumentation that's required. Let's be honest about, look, it's a statistical inference to the anomalous nature of a isotopic ratio, because it's you have one sample and you've got to sample the sample multiple times, and the sample is going to have variation, and our understanding of what the ratios are is also a function of having sampled stuff on the Earth, so it's a statistical science, right? And you can't get any maybe it's possible, but there's rarely a kill shot. Maybe if there's a 5 sigma anomaly in your isotopic ratio, then you definitely know it's not terrestrial. But the results are ambiguous, Some results are maybe 1 or 2 sigma, So, but what Gary is I think also doing in these papers, right, in mainstream journals, is what he's suggesting is that there is also another level of analysis of materials, which we don't really know much about how to do, which it can also be really interesting and revealing. And it can be very useful in forensic analysis for, like, when a plane crashes, or, or when you have to deduce, the use or the function of a material which you don't know anything about. Maybe it's Russian, maybe it's whatever. But you need to look at the atomic layering, like the actual atomic structure in fine detail. And that's like one of the most brilliant, one of the most brilliant moments, I think, of Gary's at his own Soul Foundation last year. If you go back to his talk, the absolute most important centerpiece of that talk was his innovation in this area of sort of, atomic and subatomic, analysis of materials, which it turns out we don't really know much about how to do that very well. Look at how the atoms are actually arranged, like in excruciating detail. And Gary, he's going to innovate in that area. And it's not just about UAP, right? What's I think very important to point out is that a lot of the new science of UAP, of which materials analysis is one, observational analysis is going to be this other really important thing, to try to capture, a UAP in real time. I think, what's really important is of course the standards of evidence, by which one analyzes it, but the benefits for other areas that this is going to bring about. And that's the way we have to, I think, sort of sell the study of these phenomena, is that we have to be creative about how we take the materials and look at them, and how we study the sky and the earth, because we don't quite know what it is the hell we're looking at. So we have to really be creative, integrate different fields. We have to think in new creative ways, and that produces the conditions for innovation.
And looping back to your point about Newt, the physical principles that appear to be on display should be a really enticing carrot for the scientific community, because we might
theoretical physics,
fascinating new physics.
For theoretical physics, and there may be something happening there that is relevant, for our understanding about the relationship between space, time, and matter. How can an object move without interacting with the atmosphere and be calculated in the vicinity of 5,000 G forces? That must mean that the object is or whatever agency is responsible for building it are building these objects on principles which understand how to overcome inertia and very basic facts, which we are still bound to with our conception of propulsion. I mean, propulsion for us is always, you fire some shit out the back and you go forward. I mean, there's no other option. I mean, all the propulsion that NASA's looking at is all, it's all projectile based, basically. So, anyway, so, but right there, I mean, and so that's what was an interesting also at the Sol Foundation is during Kevin's talk, this energy scientist, I forget exactly, I think he was a plasma physicist, he gets up and he's like, okay, maybe it's all, yes, we can't trust the eyewitnesses, whatever. But he's like, wait a minute. Okay. So you're telling me these pilots saw this and then it was calculated at this speed and and then he started to just assume that it was real and like I did, assume it's real. Well, wait a minute. What could possibly be the physical principles here? And what does this mean for the relationship between energy and time and space? And so he started to think like a theoretical. And that's my dream, is to have a room of physicists, doing that,
getting jobs out of their torpor into some exciting new research, discovering new stuff.
And then, and then saying to the experimentalists, which is, and this is the point I'm making with, Gary, he's an experimentalist in some ways, and he's operating in this vicinity of physics, which is very big now, technology and so on, which has this potential for innovation, which Gary will certainly do with these new instruments, right? But the ideal scenario, right, is where you have the theorists and the experimentalists talking to each other. The theorists say, so the experimentalists, the observationalists, they'll say, here is what we've observed. Here we can characterize the observations. Okay, here's the structure of observations. Here's what the stuff is doing. Here's what you can model it. Here's how you model it with Newton. It doesn't make any sense. The objects are moving with impossible speeds. They don't seem to be interacting with the atmosphere. It's a mystery. Then you give it to the theorist. They look at it. Then the theorists say, well, okay, if X, Y, and Z is the case, here's what you also should see. So you have to build your instruments to look for the following other properties. And so then the experimentalists will then construct, like the particle detectors, to look for energy interactions in the 10 trillion, giga electron volts range, So in other words, the theorists inform the experimentalists tell you what they observe, and then the observations will inform the theory, and then you go back and forth, and you do this dance, which is the core of scientific progress, in which you start to refine the observation and the experimental apparatus, which then gives the theorists a better sense of what it is that they're theorizing so that they can produce more and better models. Now, look, this ain't going to answer. This is another really important point, right? As we go into the UAP studies, the question of what that field looks like. Look, the old ufologists wanted to know, is it aliens? Well, that's not really what the new science of UAP is going to be able to really tell you. What they will be able to tell you is we have these really solidly anomalous observations of phenomena that shouldn't really occur according to principles of physics that we understand, or that actually they can tell us, no, the observations that we do see are consistent with the physics that we understand. It's just that we didn't know that the physics implied that because nobody was looking for performance on a performance envelope of that sort, which we now have kind of nailed down in our observations. But no known technology can actually produce these effects. So the only thing that the physical scientists will be able to tell us is that the best explanation is that it's of a technological origin of probably of a non-human sort. But here's the physics. Here are the physical properties that we've measured, and here are some potential ways that we could understand this based on laws of nature. Now, people want to know, yes, but is it, yes, but is it, well, sure. Well, how would we, here's where a standards of evidence committee needs to happen, right? Because, the physicists can do their job, make the measurements, and record the physical characteristics. Gary Nolan can come in and do the physical, the materials analysis and tell us something about the isotopic ratios, tell us something interesting about the atomic layering, that at the nanoscale level. Look, I mean, the engineering is just, firstly, not human, not really physically or technically possible. A, and B, the function is of a weird sort. We don't quite know what the function, there's some people talk about metamaterials and so on. Maybe that's the case or not, but that would be interesting. But, the next step is to conclude that there's a non-human agency responsible for producing these. And then the third thing I think people want to know is, so where did it come from? Was it Zeta Reticuli? Was it Alpha? Where the hell in the universe does this stuff come from? And, then people want to talk about multiple dimensions and so on and so forth, which I have a huge issue with. But that's about it. I mean, so we're never, it's going to only get to the point where, yes, we have these anomalous observations. Yes, they're strange and they're hard to explain, but here are the facts. Here's the materials. They have some anomalous characteristics that we can't explain, but that's not going to be, like the smoking gun or whatever. That's not how science is, and people are going to disagree about the same evidence. There's going to be people who are going to disagree with the results of a isotopic ratio analysis, unless you're getting like a 5 or 6 sigma, anomaly, which is what you need in particle physics, by the way, to declare a discovery. You need 6 standard deviations departure. Like a 1 chance in 10 billion or something. That's the standards for particle physics. It's less in the social sciences, like 2 sigma maybe. So that we have to decide that, like that has to be decided. We don't have that interesting decision matrix up and running. And furthermore, what are the possible declarations that serious scientists studying this phenomenon would be able to make? Okay, we've observed a solid object interacting electromagnetically and measured definitively going at 55,000 miles an hour in the atmosphere, no thermal shock, no seismic anomaly detected. we've coordinated it, we've triangulated, we've ruled out all other explanations. Here it is, right? It's kind of like the SETI signal. It's like we've got, the WOW signal. We know where it is. It's been triangulated. Multiple instruments picked it up. But what was responsible for producing it?
So next.
In other words, unfortunately, it becomes a cold case chase.
So
yeah. So my point is that I think the only thing we can ever conclude from this is that there are these anomalous occurrences that perhaps are of solid objects which produce, kinematics, velocities and accelerations that are well outside of what human objects are capable of producing, which just implies that the best explanation there is either a very unique natural phenomenon yet unknown to human science, or a technological object of non-human origin. That's about it.
Yeah. Well, that's great. This transitions well into what I think we can do as a kind of a fun outro thought experiment. Let's say we get these good observations, we're doing this good work, and we figure out that these things are physical. Let's say we pass the hurdle of deciding, okay, it's not a natural phenomenon because no aspect of meteorology or climatology as we understood stand it could potentially produce this. An interesting question how we might make that determination, but let's just say for the moment that we do. Their pilots over the years and the first CIA director have said things like, it's obviously intelligent. Like, we're just looking at it and we're making the human judgment that we are interfacing with some kind of intelligence. So let's say we rigorously demonstrate that somehow. So now we've got scientific proof and that it's a physical object, and scientific proof that it's technological. So in that world, maybe 7, 12 years from now, maybe 6 months from now, the only next step, or one natural next step, would be to reach out in some way to get some kind of confirmation from an intelligent source if we are in fact in relationship to such an intelligent being or system, of its existence and its intentions toward us. And so the thought experiment fun question here is, how would you design a system to instigate that public contact, and what kind of people would you want on board? What kind of institutions and fields of study would you want to recruit in moving toward that kind of interface?
In other words, like first contact?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it as public first contact because as far as we know, I mean, we don't know this, but serious people have made the allegations that there have been some forms of contact deep in the military and intelligence community. Giant question mark. Who knows if that's true? But we know for sure that there hasn't been any public contact. And again, this is all happening within the parentheses.
I don't know. I mean,
turn out to be intelligent. How would we try to talk to them?
The problem is that, I mean, look, the universe, as many hundreds of thousands of tens of thousands of people have said the same thing over and over again. But the universe is so damn vast. Come on. There's going to be a variety of forms of life and intelligence, therefore corresponding to it, I think. So we've just seen not even a fraction of a percent of what is, what exists. So surely it's brimming, with different and exotic forms. And therein lies the problem, is that we have this notion, right, that which I think is in many ways is a function of science fiction and literature, of contact, of what contact means. And it's a very, individual to another individual, or a collection of individuals, arriving, and then, the earth has to respond in some collective or whatever concerted way, with a collection of individuals communicating in some way. And sending an entourage there or them, how many times have you seen that in science fiction? It's always there. But I think that and this is where it gets a little weirder, maybe, but there isn't much to say, because I mean it's something that has to be thought through very carefully. I mean, I can't do that right here, but I think that communication, or contact, if you will, is really going to be a very complicated structure of elusive indications and incomplete gestures and like sideways glances and seeing things at a right, at a askew, and a dance, and incompatible to some extent, unless a framework, a common or a shared framework of communication is established somehow. And there are people thinking about that, and that's where the astrobiology, thinking about the structure of intelligent exchange, communication, right?
Mm.
Literally communion, to come together and exchange information and awareness and experience and so on. There are people thinking about that in the astrobiology community. I heard a great talk precisely about that, and worrying about the problems that would be involved in two different intelligences or agencies attempting to communicate when the differences are so radical. I mean, we have, on the planet Earth, it's somewhat easy in a sense to communicate. It's easier perhaps to communicate with a dolphin than it would be with a species that is from a remote quadrant of the galaxy, or of the universe. I mean, doesn't have to be. I mean, there are tens of billions of galaxies, the closest being Andromeda at 2.3 million light years away, right? Talk about being lonely. I mean, the galaxy is big enough, I guess, but then you think, Jesus, it takes 2.3 million light years just to get to the next galaxy. So, I think it's going to be easier to communicate with dolphins than it is perhaps to communicate with these other beings, especially if they're able to get to the Earth. That really means that they have an understanding of the way that space, time, and matter works that we simply have no really grasp of. So there are a number of preliminary things that I think have to be taken into consideration before I can get to a plausible public contact scenario, because I think of the complexities of what communication is going to be. And one fallacy is to think that if there is an agency behind some of these objects, some of these phenomena, one fallacy is to think that they think of us as individuals. In many cases, the UAP encounters at closer range don't seem to give a shit about us. I mean, they don't. It's just there and then gone, or you start reading Vallée and all these stories about the little creatures or whatever. I mean, it just doesn't seem like there's any So it may just be the case that like an ant colony acts as a collective. It may just simply be the case that some of the agency that we may be dealing with in some of these cases looks at the human as just a component in a larger sort of organic sort of integrated organic structure, which they conceptualize in ways that we simply do not have the tools for. I mean, we see ourselves as these, at the top as an intellectual, pinnacle and ruling over the earth in some sense, with these theological connotations. We see ourselves as individuals, right? And that contact will happen between one mind and another mind through language, etc. We have, we have this very definite idea, but I mean, maybe not. I mean, maybe they just see, and furthermore, I mean, if they're able to travel, interstellar distances as these objects, as Kevin points out, right, in his 2019 paper, look, I mean, at the speeds that these objects have actually been observed to move at. Let's just start with what has been observed. Another part of this interview, which was kind of ontologically shocking for me, if you will, was just to think about, wait a minute. So, before we talk about extra dimensions and all this other crap, look, we know that, yes, okay, we don't understand technologically how to get to, 90% the speed of light or something, in a fraction of a second, but these objects, like the Nimitz thing, and look, it was observed, with 5 to 6,000 Gs, like and it could do that on impulse. Like it was all that happened within, Kevin Day said, I looked at, it was 3/4 of a second, basically. I mean, 0.73 seconds, right? I mean, and that object was able to do that under control and stop at 50 feet above the ocean, which is where the radar said that it was after 3/4 of a second elapsed. Once the scope indicated its subsequent position, that indicates the capacity to manipulate, right, the motions in such a way that if it didn't stop at 50, it could have just kept going, okay? And it doesn't interact with the atmosphere, so it could have kept going. Maybe it could even go through the Earth, who knows? Just imagine it just went and kept going and going. Well, Kevin calculated, like, so in, 3 or 4 hours, guess what? The thing is moving at, 70% the speed of light. You give it a few more hours, it's about 99%. It's already, so Kevin likes to point out, why do we think that these are spacecraft? Because they move like spacecraft would move. They don't interact with, they seem to be sealed off from the atmosphere, and they don't, no thermal shock, no frictional force. They seem to have no inertial response under great, gravitational forces. So they seem, like I like to say, they seem to move as if their mass was kinematically irrelevant. Like there was no mass, right? That's like a photon. A photon can do a right angle, and it's traveling at 186,000 miles per second. It can do a right angle because I could put a mirror and it can do a right angle because it has no mass. And so when you do if it has no mass, then it works out, right? If it has mass, then it's it's infinite, right? Like, so it's a problem. So clearly the objects that we have observed, yes, okay, it's not on well-calibrated instruments, which we hope to observe in the research programs that we hope will be sustained with funding and academic support, generational support. But these objects have already demonstrated relativistic capabilities. So back to the question of communication. Kevin pointed it out. It's brilliant, right? Look, I mean, if you can get to this 90%, 99% of the speed of light, you're going to have relativistic effects kick in. So you go away from the Earth, moving at 10, 20,000 Gs, and you're at 99% of the speed of light in a couple of hours. You go off, you journey however far, and then you come back, okay? Relative to our chronological unfolding, many tens and tens of thousands of years could have elapsed. Whereas for you, it was maybe 2 days ship time. And you could have been here to the edge of the galaxy and back, right? Relative to your ship time, it's, maybe a few days, a few hours. When you come back to the place you just left, the Earth, hundreds of thousands of years could have elapsed. So imagine a species that is nomadically wandering around and like zipping around and just pointing itself to stars. You can imagine a species that has that capability sending out, from its location radially, everywhere, sending these kinds of objects out, just exploring. Nomadically, right? They're going to have a relativistic experience of history. And so imagine you sample the Earth, over a period of a few years of your own, whatever, itinerary you have. And you come back to the Earth over and over again. Well, look, you're not going to care about the White House. I mean, you're not going to care about freaking nuclear, what you might be curious that there are extra neutrinos, in this location that there weren't before, when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth. And now you've got like neutrinos. So what the fuck is that? So okay, so they may be attracted to nuclear facilities, and there may be some interest in that because it's not a natural production. That concentration of neutrinos or whatever is going to be unnatural. I mean, it's and if you have any kind of scientific instrumentation, you're going to know about that, and you're probably going to be aware of that kind of energy being concentrated. And you're like, oh, that's curious. But I mean, imagine a relativistic species that's nomadically traveling throughout the galaxy. You're just going to look at like, individual Earth events, like just grains of sand blowing away on the shore. You care about the large structure of time, the granulated details, which is where we're trapped on the Earth, because we don't have the relativistic, and we're stuck going 70 kilometers a second around the sun or whatever it is. We're all on the Earth together, so our experience of history is pretty uniform. But imagine having to share historical accounts with species that have relativistic sense of time. There's an incompatibility there, because they're looking at large large scale movements of geological structures and cultures, and so their engagement may simply be a function of their experience of time, which is so out of sync with ours, so as to make them utterly uninterested in any minute by minute or month by month details in the history of the Earth. So there's never going to be a White House lawn. Okay, even though in July of 1953, over the White House, you had the ships or whatever, or the these luminous objects, the flap in the 52, I think it was.
Yep, it's 52.
Anyway, right. So I just don't think now. Okay, the abduction thing is a whole other question. Right? That's where people say, "No, look, it was an alien. It was an entity. I heard its thought. I don't know what to say." There, that's a whole other sensitive topic. But as to this, the ships are here in the sky, kind of like they arrive and all over the Earth, and they send an entourage down, and there's a public thing. Who would you send? I don't know. It's like maybe Arrival. That's probably the best depiction, and there the species actually was a time traveling kind of, their experience was essentially relativistic. And so
you send a linguist and a physicist for sure.
Yeah, you had, right, exactly. And so the nature of their language was temporal in ways in which our language is not. Our language is fixed on the page, and when I say something, it's in discrete units of sound, and and we understand it sort of statically as in motion like that. But the species there, they emitted these like ink blots, but the changes in the ink blots were grammatical, like they had meaning, so and they were very temporally embedded creatures in ways in which we just have no concept of.
And shout out to this story of your life, which is the foundation for Arrival, written by Ted Chiang. The short story collection is beautiful. If anybody listening hasn't read it,
absolutely, 100%,
strongly recommend.
Yeah, super great. I mean, that's a great place to start thinking about the intricacies of communication, which he does. I mean, in many ways, you can read it as a sort of a treatise on different ways of communicating and how to bring them together. But I don't know. I mean, I don't see it as like this thing. I mean, I don't know. I see it as very much more elusive. Yeah, this is in these moments. I'm more like Valet, even though I'm a critic of Valet's thinking, Jacques Valet's thinking. I'm planning a project, by the way, in Germany. This is another reason why I'm in Europe, as I hopefully I'll get it. I haven't heard yet, but a fellowship in Germany. I propose to do a book on Valet, a systematic.
Oh, cool.
account. Nobody's really done that. So I think that certainly needs to be done.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, going all the way from the beginning, where he started and his mentors and so on, Amy Michel and Claude and all the French tradition, and then his American Odyssey, and getting involved in Silicon Valley in the early days of the internet, AI. He has got it. The guy is classically, storied individual with contacts all over in different areas of interest in 20th century science and technology, right? I mean, he's very fast. I've been in his company, but I've never approached him to say hi or have. No, I don't like to do that. I don't. I think I might have even been in a photograph with him at an event in France, but I don't know. I don't like that. I don't like the cult of personality thing.
You said you lived in LA for a little while. You picked that up.
Yeah,
you don't go up to people.
I don't, I mean, I went up to Jamie Foxx and introduced myself after seeing the premiere of Varginha in LA. He invited us to an underground bar that night, and so I went, and it was like this super fun thing. And I had just founded the society in the journal, and so and I walked up to Jamie, and he gave me his number. So.
Well, heck yeah, maybe he wants to fund some projects.
No, well, certainly. That's another thing, is that the society, I want to be the NPR of the UAP world. I want to be the sort of the place where we are, of course, accepting and so on, but we don't check our critical faculties out at the door.
Yeah.
We are still scholars.
Right.
We still will differ in our opinions, but we treat this topic seriously and with the care, academic seriousness, and generational stability that is needed to make progress, right? We don't dismiss and we don't accept uncritically. We do think that there is a certain core of compelling cases, but again, forensics is going to be indeterminate. We need to turn to a new science, and that is a very terrestrial science in the beginning. And that's what we emphasize, is that we have to start with what we can understand in the human and terrestrial world. So to understand anything anomalous, we have to understand the baseline, whether that be human experience and human psychological reality, or whether that be the physical, the sort of physical space, if you will. And then to be sensitive to the gaps in science where you have a psychophysical interaction, right? You have the problem of consciousness, to bring back, another topic. This is a known issue in science. There surely is going to be an implication of that problem within UAP studies. It is surely going to impact us. Why? Because we know the physical sciences have trouble dealing with psychological and internal reality. I mean, the reality that we experience as conscious beings, consciousness itself is a problem for science. We know that that is a blind spot. But the question is, how do you study a problem which may possibly inhabit the blind spot? Yeah, but even before that, the question is, what aspects of the UAP phenomenon, of the phenomenon, as people like to say, what aspects of that should plausibly be located precisely within this blind spot of psychophysical reality?
So you know what you're looking for.
Yeah, so where there's some more subtle interaction going on, which involves to some extent consciousness, but which also involves aspects of the physical world that are related in intrinsic ways to consciousness. How do we think about that?
Fitting that you should mention that, because you reference the journal Mind and Matter in your introductory essay at the beginning of Limina as a sort of jumping off point and a place of inspiration for this field of study.
Absolutely.
So as we transition toward a landing here, I just want to ask how you would like people to engage with you and with your society and with Limina going forward in the next few years. Where should they find you? What should they research? How should they reach out, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the journal, people should, check out our websites, plural. I mean, we have the Society for UAP Studies.org, or I should say not the society, but it's Society for UAP Studies.org. that has everything on it. We are an evolving organization. We are academics who have, and some professionals from, from the tradition of ufology. We're in conversation with that tradition. We absolutely do not dismiss it. We use it to inform our work. I mean, it's a valuable work. It needs to be done. I'm not, we're not calling for the end of that or anything like that. But but properly sort of understood in a historical context. But so there, of course, the society, we are academics. We are not, we have some anonymous donors, but we are largely funded, by the people. We our base of funding are, we have tuition from our courses. We have people who are our supporters, and that's what we would like from the general community of people who are interested in getting, the support that academics, scholars, and other serious professionals need to study the phenomenon, no matter what we believe ultimately about it. But we have to establish a kind of a consistent, academically well-grounded, stabilized framework and a discourse to go along with it, which is that generational and so on, which produces future researchers and scholars. We have to support that. I think that it should be something supported by the community, by people who want to see this thing become, a solid discipline, which is treated seriously with respect within the academy. So we're looking for the general community supporter, right? That's one of our categories of support. Give us a few bucks a month, and we get our projects funded, and we open up that space of legitimacy, academic legibility, stability. We're developing and innovating coursework. We're giving academics the tools that they need to engage in that dynamic, development of a discipline that is, it's in the process of forming. And we're getting together and forming it. We're informing it with the interdisciplinary approach that we take. We respect all disciplines. The challenge is, of course, communication across different disciplines between the sciences and the humanities. This is a big thing. So that's where we are. So we're looking for community supporters. If you're an academic and interested, certainly you can contact us to become more formally affiliated. We are an academic and learned society, and a professional association. So we're looking for, researchers, academics, scholars, people who have worked in this field and so on. So we accept applications for affiliate status from those individuals, but we welcome, everybody. We have events that are generally interesting events, at least we hope, for a broader, community. And we see ourselves as a bridge as well between the academic scholarly world and the world of the sciences and humanistic scholars and just the general public, who want to learn, who want to know, and who want to help. And how can you help? Well, like, for NPR, a contribution, So we're looking for very little. We're hoping that there are tens of thousands of people who are like, yeah, we want to see the society, which is an independent nonprofit association, right? It's of scholars. Mm-hmm. We're not affiliated with the military. We don't have big, connections to any corporations or anything. This is very much a kind of a academics, grassroots, professional thing. And we're respecting the academic tradition because we think that the respectability can only come from starting with the respect that we as scholars have built for our own traditions and the scholarly practice. And that brings us to the to the point of the journal, which is to have a forum, within which to communicate and contribute to the development of the field and to communicate our results and our disagreements and our arguments, in a respectful way, and to share, to share that with anyone who's interested in reading, but also with our colleagues who are also researching. There are no journals really to do that for specifically UAP studies. And I think that really is what you need if the field is going to solidify and crystallize into something real and something generational and attracting future scholars. And so the journal is Limina, the Journal of UAP Studies. We have our website, limina.uapstudies.org, I believe, is the journal's website. We also have a sort of a formal platform where the content is hosted, so people should keep up with us there, sign up for the newsletter. But we're still we're still organizing, we're still in the formative phase, and attempting to build out our base of support and our organizational structure. So if people are interested in contributing there, to us on the back end, we're also interested in people who have organizational skills, at the director level, maybe at the executive level, as well as we build out the organization. We're very small now, we're very lean, but we're looking to kind of be sort of something in between the American Geophysical Society and maybe the European Astrobiology Institute. Something that is, it's large enough, but it's also still, small enough that it's personal, and we know each other, and it isn't so bureaucratized, as it were. But who knows? These things can have a life of their own. But so our goal is twofold. Not only to be self-funding, so that I and my colleagues can be paid for this, instead of having to do this on our off hours. We need to that's another thing that you need to pay people to do the work, to do good work, right? I mean, you have to have the focus. So we need that. We need to attract people for whom we can pay them to be part of this, to do it for their actual main gig. And I don't only mean operationally, I want to hire directors and managers and a staff and so on. We need that on the back end. But in terms of the content, I need to have funding sources so I can have fellowships to support scholars in the summer to go to conferences, to support their their scholarly research. I want to have visiting fellows. I want to have all the apparatus that you have in the academy, and offer, teaching positions and so on and so, course development, curriculum development, other programs, conferences. We need sort of funding for that. I want to have money for students. You need to attract students. How do you attract students? Well, I can fund, part of your PhD program, or I can give you support money to go do a project, or something like that. So the first goal, of course, is to be sort of self-funded to cover our operational and programs costs. But also the second, really, my dream is, the second goal is to be a resource for scholars, to be paid to do their research, to maybe give them, to pay their salary, to say, hey, your university will let you go for a year. You do your UAP research. I'll pay your salary, and you do that research, and we'll give you resources, and we'll fly you, and we'll take care of you. So I want to be that. But I want that to be not just a function of, maybe we can get donations from individuals who can afford to donate significantly to us. That would be wonderful. Obviously, benefactors are how the sciences developed in the Renaissance and in the modern world. Benefactors are wonderful. Grants from the government would be great if we could get those. But also, what would be really unique here, I think, is if we were a community, like NPR, right? Like, we were a community-sponsored, community-supported organization, where people are proud to say, hey, yes, I support this society, and look what they're doing. They're opening up this space. They've got these conferences, where it's academic sharing, and it's a safe space, but it's a critical space, right? They're doing their work, and look, I'm supporting that, and then the society also will offer, we offer maybe the opportunity for our, for community engagement, to be in our citizen science projects, right? We have one of our members, Dan Williams, is really brilliant with organizing various ideas on citizen science projects, where we can connect with NASA, even perhaps get grants to do citizen science projects, searching through satellite photographs for anomalous objects, using AI to identify, anomalous objects. And so, interesting projects. that could be useful to other sciences, right, where you're doing classification and training of AI, but also which would be interesting to the general public to be like, hey, instead of like arguing with some skeptic on UFO Twitter, you could come off of that and then you can be part of a science project, like NASA has done with SETI and other projects. So that's, so we also want to be, a source of inspiration, also a source of engagement on, the citizen science front. So getting citizens directly involved in some of this work, So that's us.
That's a wonderful vision, man. It's a really exciting program that you're building. People, again, should go to societyforuapstudies.org. Check this out, get involved, make a donation, maybe do some of the citizen science. If you're an academic, reach out, apply, contribute, and everybody should go read that first edition of Limina and keep their eyes on the skies for the next volume.
It's coming out. We've got a bunch of papers, conference. We've got a whole bunch of papers that were submitted in the pipeline. So we're excited to develop that even more. So yeah. So hopefully the end of the month, I'm sorry, at the end of the year, we'll have volume, issue number 2. We'll see how it goes.
Well, I'll be really excited for when it drops, and I will mention it here and flag it to everybody who's listening. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time today.
It's been like, 4 hours. I haven't lost track.
Yeah, we're definitely a clean 3 and some change. So I really appreciate you spending this time.
It's been fun.
Same here. Maybe in a couple years, we can reconnect and compare notes on how the phenomenon has evolved and the studies of it have deepened and expanded.
Thank you. So let's keep in touch.
Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
Thank you.